Welcome to Mavericks with Marty. I'm Marty KOTIS, your host, and today I have with me Joe Killian from NC Policy Watch. Joe is very much a liberal media reporter, and often either I am or one of the boards I serve on are the target of one of his pieces. But I've often found Joe to be very fair in his reporting in terms of getting the quotes right and at least giving the people he's criticizing a chance to make a comment. Now, not everyone chooses to do that, and a lot of people do avoid the media. But I don't shy away from it simply because I believe I'm comfortable in my decision-making, why I do something, and if I'm going to vote on something and it's regarding something that's going to impact the public or the university, I should be willing to articulate why I voted on that or why I said what I said. And again, I've found Joe to be fair about getting my quotes right. We have a chance to talk about journalism overall. We talk about the fact that Joe grew up in trailer parks, and we talk about how different backgrounds lead to different opinions.
And I had to tell them, that's where I'm from. But for, a few small things, that's where I would have gone to college. Why do you think I think that's shameful? Why do you think that I think that that is, beneath someone who should be on the board of governors, who should be the head of the board of governors? I think that it's admirable that somebody who comes from a modest background, went to a community college, has risen to the level where they're now making decisions at the UNC system level and are looked to by the other board of governors members as a leader. Why would that be a bad thing? And people were like, what are you talking about? And I think because of the way I speak, because of I don't have a strong accent, because of the way I dress or something, because I work for a newspaper, people
just assume you're liberal. So
they think I'm liberal. They think I'm a Yankee. They think that I went to Duke or UNC or Johns Hopkins or something, and they just don't understand that I'm Eastern North Carolina trailer trash. I come from a very modest background, and the people in my family were commercial fishermen. My grandfather, who I told you about, and my uncle, they died at sea as commercial fishermen, not that long ago. So the idea that I would in some way have affinity with them and look down on Randy Ramsey is just silly.
Joe talks about how his mother gave him some great advice about what it meant to be a maverick and to voice your opinion and the impacts of that sort of decision to take that path.
I think I was 12 years old. I got to that point in your young development as a young man where I started having strong opinions and voicing strong opinions. And my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and she said, let me tell you this. It's a free country. You can say whatever you want, but what you say and how you say it will always have consequences. Sometimes that consequence will just be people will think you're an asshole and they won't want to talk to you anymore and they won't want to listen to you anymore.
We talk about what it means to be a maverick.
And I think, in terms of being a maverick, I think that the most maverick thing you can do is make up your mind for yourself and don't be a team player.
We talk about the similarity between Trump and Bernie Sanders camps.
I don't think that either ethically or morally or politically, I don't think that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are equivalent. But I don't much like either of them. And I don't much like either of the people who are really into them. I had to go to a bunch of Trump rallies during that period when he came through North Carolina. Pretty much every time he came through North Carolina, wherever it was, we were going. Hillary Clinton rallies. I had to go to Bernie Sanders rallies. And I can tell you that I had the worst time at Trump rallies and Bernie Sanders rallies.
We talk about Ben Shapiro and freedom of speech. We get into the whole UNC journalism issue.
And so I think it's basically this fascinating story, which is one of the reasons why I began writing about it. It's this fascinating story about two people who are generations apart, who are different genders, who are different races, who are both journalists, and who have differing ideas about journalism, which is itself, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, undergoing something of an evolution, not only in the delivery methods, not only in how we pay for it, not only in how it's presented to us, but also in what journalism is.
We have a chance to talk about the history of newspapers and journalism and how it's changed over the years. We talk about cancel culture and what does it really mean? And what are the impacts of cancel culture?
So, like, when we say canceled, I always ask people, like, honestly, not because I'm trying to be an asshole. What do you mean by that? Like, what is the real consequence of saying a controversial thing? It's what my mother said to me when I was 12 years old, right? Some people might think you're an asshole. They might not want to listen to you anymore, and they might not want to talk to you anymore. But you know who's going to want to listen to and talk to you? The people who agree with that stuff. And that's an enormous audience. Joe Rogan is doing fine. You know, so Neil Young is mad at him? Who gives a shit? Did I cancel my Spotify subscription? I did. Do they care? No, absolutely not. Let me go to Tidal. You know why? Joe Rogan's got the biggest podcast audience of anybody.
We talk about how it's not a bad thing to change your mind.
One of the things that I remember him saying that really stuck with me was, when in this country did it become such a bad thing to change your mind? If you're a politician now and you're in a different, you're in a different place on a political issue than you were 10 years ago, good for you. You know what I mean? Who wants to be the same person they were when they were 20 years old on anything?
Well, thanks, Joe, for coming on Mavericks. You are one of my first few guests on here, and I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for the invitation.
And we've known each other for a number of years when you were back at the News and Record, covering different things in town. And then most recently with NC Policy Watch, mainly focused on Board of Governors stuff and then some other politics out there as well. So if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Joe Killian. I'm an investigative reporter for NC Policy Watch. I was in daily newspapers for a decade, 15 years, something like that, depending upon how far back you really want to go. And I've been at NC Policy Watch, a nonprofit newsroom based in Raleigh, North Carolina, for a little over 5 years now.
Now, I know how a lot of my friends describe NC Policy Watch, but how would you describe NC Policy Watch?
Well, you know, people say, like, you know, left-leaning NC Policy Watch or Policy Watch, a project of the left-leaning North Carolina Justice Center or anything like that. That doesn't bother me. I mean, you know, primarily I think because I don't think I ever worked for any publication, no matter how straight it was or how, you know, much of a large daily newspaper it was, where somebody didn't have some opinion about it. The thing that I always say about Policy Watch, though, is like, it's a nonprofit newsroom that's part of a nonprofit newsroom network that's in 20 plus states now, or an affiliate of that network. And the difference is that you know where the money's coming from. It's a nonprofit. You know where the money's coming from. You know who's on the board of directors. You know all that stuff. When I worked for the News and Record had a lobbyist that they sent to Raleigh, but you never heard about that. You didn't hear about it in the newsroom. You didn't hear about it outside the newsroom. But there's no large newspaper that doesn't have a lobbyist, right? And so the idea that the North Carolina Justice Center does lobbying work or sues people for civil rights stuff or whatever, and that we're, a project of the Justice Center, you know, to me, that doesn't much bother me. I mean, if anybody's got a problem with people suing people over civil rights abuses, you know, it's colleagues of mine who are like attorneys who aren't part of Policy Watch, but are part of the Justice Center. You know, like, for instance, they like sue hotels and motels in areas that have decided that they're not going to rent rooms to Native Americans, right? If anybody's got a problem with that, have a problem with it all day. If you think it makes me part of some left-wing conspiracy, no problem with that either. One of the things that I think I've always prided myself in as a reporter is that the people who I report on, if they're Republicans, if they're Democrats, if they're libertarians, if they're socialists, whoever they are, they feel like I'm fair to them. And, you know, like if they got a problem with, and you know this from my reporting on you, if they've got a problem with something I've written, they can call me up and talk to me about it. If they think I got something wrong, I'm open to, to fixing it, and I don't feel like people walk away from my reporting going, that guy's really unfair, which is my big concern.
I definitely agree with that. You know, I know a lot of people out there, some of my friends that say, oh, I'm not going to talk to Joe Killian.
Sure.
You know, I know the punchline for the story. And I say, yeah, you know, you may know the punchline for the story, but he is fair in his reporting in terms of accurately getting the quotes right. And, you know, and that, frankly, that's a big problem out there is people misquoting someone. But if you're getting the quotes right, to me, that's 50% fair right there.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, I think you do present, we know it's going to be Republicans are bad, in a lot of those articles. And that's the story. But at least if you tell some portion of it that explains the viewpoint of the other side, in my opinion, that's better than if we put our head in the sand and don't talk to you. And then you're only reporting one side of it. And then you're saying, hey, I reached out to the board of governors or the trustees and got no comment.
Right. And one of the things that I think people, journalists screw this up, whoever they work for, it happens. One of the things that I think you need to be able to say when you write a story is, I reached out to those people. If they wanted to be in my story, they could have just as much real estate as anybody else, but they either chose not to get back to me or they sent me a one-line statement or whatever. And that's just where it is. I've definitely talked to people on both sides of the political aisle who, talked to me about a story and it changed the way I saw the story. It changed how I saw the story or how I reported the story or what kind of questions I asked. And I do think that if you can just decide not to engage with media, that's fine. That's your right. If you want to have some agency in how that story comes out, be it what you said in the story, or just you want to talk to the reporter so they know where you're coming from, maybe give them some evidence or some insight they don't have, then you gotta give them a chance. And I mean, great reporters exist at every kind of newspaper. I mean, I used to love reporting next to Carrie Travis, who worked for the Carolina Journal. It's kind of the NC Policy Watch's opposite number out of the Locke Foundation, right? I never really had like a personal problem with John Hammer when I was reporting next to him at city council meetings for the Rhino Times. He wrote some stuff about me that was a little weird, but like on a personal level, he and I never had a problem. Scott Yost, who used to work for the Rhino Times here in Greensboro, sort of a right-wing weekly. It's like if we were at a meeting and I had a sandwich and he didn't have a sandwich and it was going late, I'd cut it in half and give him half. It's like reporters like reporters. And I don't really
It can be like attorneys on two sides of an issue. At the end of the day, they can still go out and, have a meal or something afterwards and chit chat and put that behind them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, it does seem like there's obviously media has changed drastically.
And continues to change.
When you think, I was talking to Margaret Moffat the other day and she was telling me about the size or the number of reporters that were at the News and Record back in the day versus now. It's gone from 100 down to 4 or 3?
I'm not sure how many people are over there anymore. When I was there, so my first day at the News and Record, so I started off, I had an internship at the News and Record and I would freelance some pieces for them while I was a student at UNCG. And when I walked in there, it was just bustling and full of reporters, and it had its own cafeteria at the bottom that was completely self-sufficient, and cars were going in and out, and the advertising people were buzzing, and the whole building was full. They didn't have enough space for people. They were trying to figure out where they were going to put desks. And that was down from where it had been 5 years or 10 years earlier. You know what I mean? And it was the third largest newspaper in the state, only to the Charlotte Observer and the News and Record. Because those are the largest cities, and it was just really bustling. But I mean, management was the real problem. I mean, all of print media kind of hit a shoal where it didn't deal with the internet properly, and Craigslist came in and ate its advertising lunch on certain types of ads, and they screwed up subscription models and how you're going to price digital ads and if you're going to expect people to pay for stuff online or not. It's like a guy who, great Baltimore reporter who's, God, why is his name escaping me? Who did The Wire? What it's based on The Wire years ago when he was working for the Sun in Baltimore. He said he told his bosses, it's like the early 90s, you can't give away your product for free and then insist that people pay for it. They're just going to think it's worth nothing. And they were like, what, are you crazy? Come on. And 5 years later, they were like, maybe we shouldn't be giving this stuff away for free. And nowadays, it's like if you ask people to pay for even a digital subscription, which is dramatically less expensive than a paper subscription in most places, they just seem baffled that you would ask them to pay anything. And meanwhile, all these people have to put the thing together. They have to do the reporting. They have to,
the internet's definitely train people to think that information should always be free out there. And then also, since maybe 2010 or so, the social media advertising elements where you can run an ad, see it hit immediately, track who clicked on it. There's been a lot of competition for how to reach consumers and how people are getting their news. I read something the other day that was saying that the main source of news for most citizens is Facebook.
At least it's not TikTok.
Yeah.
Well, my thing is so I will always have a sentimental place in my heart for newspapers because I came up in newspapers. I grew up in newsrooms. I love the smell of the presses. I like seeing your thing on the front page, but to me, the journalism is important as long as that continues. I think that's the important thing. And the delivery method is not so important. That might come from being a kid who was just generationally, I remember very clearly a time before the internet, a time after the internet, a time before social media and a time after social media. I think if you've had both of those experiences, you realize that everything is transitory. At one point, MySpace was all, at one point, Friendster was going to be the big thing, and I'm just not opposed to reading something on my phone or an iPad or a laptop. I'm fine with that. I think a lot of people who are running, particularly newspapers, but really all of media, for a very long time, and sometimes people who continue to run that sort of legacy media, just have this idea that if they, hold firm and put their hands up, they're going to stop the tide. And that's just not, you just got to move with stuff. And
like auto manufacturers in the 70s
Yeah.
and the resistance. And then you're trying to put up tariffs to prevent competition from coming in. But now look where we are.
Yeah. And you know what's really funny is I was thinking about this the other day when I was listening to a podcast. I think it's really funny how now, with all the new tools we have and all the new distribution and all that, we're basically recreating what we had in the 30s and 40s. When you think about it, it's like I listen to massively popular podcasts right now. Joe Rogan, Mark Maron, like that level of like millions of people listening to it. And what are they doing? They're doing their own advertisements. Like people on the radio in the 30s, you're going to love Lucky Strikes, right? Except now it's like stamps.com, right? Or Casper mattresses. This is the best mattress I've ever, it's like, that's what DJs in the 30s did, and they were in little places where they were doing it in a room, as large as this. And they had sponsors that would pay for this much of it. And then it turned into this enormous thing. And then all of that caved and is now being rebuilt in the same type of way, but just digitally. And newspapers are the same way. And newspapers and other media are the same way. When people talk to me about how, the media has changed and, we need to get back to the old days of impartiality and objectivity and all that. In this country, the first newspapers were partisan broadsides. We're going to go see Hamilton at the Greensboro at the Tanger Center tonight downtown, my wife and I. And there's a whole song in there about how Hamilton is going to anonymously under pseudonym, essentially slander his political rivals using newspapers, right? I mean, those were the foundations of what we came to think of as journalism, which people tried to teach and practice as a discipline and a science for a small period in journalism's history. But journalism encompasses everything. It's straight daily newspaper reporting. It's long form magazine stuff. It's John Hood and it's Nikole Hannah-Jones. It's, it's Ben Shapiro writing columns for Newsweek. It's, it's Glenn Greenwald and it's, all those things are journalism. None of that stuff isn't real journalism.
But hasn't the money and the attention span of the consumer changed significantly where, you used to be able to get paid to do a very thorough investigative piece perhaps. And now, that gig doesn't exist out there as much.
I think that's
especially
changing.
Like the News and Record.
Yeah.
And you're being tasked to cover a whole host of things. And so it's a light touch. It's a short kind of clickbait article. You can't do a deep dive. And so that's very different from when you or Margaret were doing these more kind of hard-hitting investigative pieces in Greensboro, but you might work on it for 6 months.
Yeah. Well, at my time in journalism, I'm almost 40 now. So Margaret could talk to this probably a little better than I could because I think she was in the business in a little bit of a different time. When I came into journalism, at least at local newspapers, the job where you could work on for something for 6 months, they've had maybe 2 of those in the whole newsroom. Taft Wireback did that, right? Or, Lorraine Ahern used to do that a bit, or these are just names from News and Record history. Everybody else was writing dailies. I used to write between 200 and 300 stories a year for the News and Record when I worked there, right? When I first started out, it was like 100 and something, and it worked up to just more and more and more. And, like most reporters were doing that. And I don't mean last year, I mean 10 years ago, you know what I mean? So those jobs where you do that deep a dive, especially for a local newspaper. Now for a magazine, that's different. For the New York Times, that's different. For the LA Times, that used to be different. I think in your local newspaper, having a really good investigative journalist who would put that much effort into it and that much time and be given that many resources to do it has been rare for decades now. But the difference now is things are replacing that. Now there's ProPublica. Now there's, Report for America. Now there's the State's Newsroom Network, which is the affiliate thing that I'm part of. Like, we have reporters who will spend months on things. Why? Because it's not a subscription model. It's not a clickbait model. We don't sell any advertising, So like what we're doing because the people who put money into it believe that it needs to be done and are willing to finance that. But
don't they also believe that these stories will impact elections in the end? I mean,
it depends on who it is. I mean, we're part of a 501c3. So if we impact elections or we're trying to impact elections or whatever, we could lose our status.
Well, come on, don't you do that every day?
Well, I mean, the people who, like Rob Schofield, I think writes commentary, and his commentaries are usually, here's, why this Republican policy is bad or whatever. My thing is like, the stuff that I'm writing about is about the people in power. Who's in power right now? North Carolina Republicans. I mean, look around in state government. The Democratic Party is almost an also-ran. I mean, the governor is a Democrat and he can veto things right now. And right now there's a slim, by a slim margin, they can sustain his veto. But the people who are sort of like moving policy, people who are deciding what bills move and things, those are Republicans. Policy Watch has a kind of a rich history of destroying Democratic careers too. I mean, stuff that they did before I got there sent a Democratic politician to jail. Billy Ball, my old colleague Billy Ball, he wrote a story about sexual harassment at the General Assembly that centered entirely on a Democratic politician. So in terms of that, I mean, and my thing is too, I don't care who's a Democrat and who's a Republican. I know that people might not believe me when I say that, but I grew up on military bases and trailer parks, right? My dad was a career Marine. My grandfathers were Navy guys. We went hunting and fishing and, mud trucking and,
So where's home?
Well, that's a good question. Whenever you ask a military kid that, they go, it's complicated, right? I was born in North Carolina. I was born in Eastern North Carolina. I was technically born in Morehead City, North Carolina, but that's because that's where the nearest hospital was. We lived my mother's family lived in a unincorporated part of Carteret County. If we were closer to Eastern North Carolina, I could tell you Broad Creek and you would know where that was. But if you get 10 miles from Broad Creek, not so much. Randy Ramsey, who's the current head of the UNC Board of Governors, like he and I are basically from the same place. A little, as they say down there, up the road a piece. But my dad was born in the Bronx and he grew up in the Bronx in the 70s and was a career Marine. He met my mother at a military base in North Carolina, and we bounced around a bit. We were stationed at Camp Lejeune. We were stationed at Cherry Point and Havelock. We were the longest we ever stayed anywhere was 3 years, and that was in Bristol, Connecticut, where there was a Marine Reserve station and some Navy bases up there. And then I came back down here for college. My dad was a Marine, and he was in Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and then Desert Storm. He was in the most recent Iraq War, the sequel, Electric Boogaloo. He was in Bosnia. He was like all over the world. Gone a whole lot when we were kids. And my grandfather, both my grandfathers were Navy guys. but the only reason I didn't join the Marines is because my dad talked me out of it. Nobody in my family had gone to college, and I seemed like the kind of bookish kid who probably should go to college, and I did go to college. But then the beginning of my
you went to UNCG.
I went to UNCG, and my sophomore year, the beginning of my sophomore year, 9/11 happened, right? And I was coming from a military family and a military background, seeing this unprecedented thing happen to America. I thought this was my generation's Pearl Harbor moment. I thought we were all going to join up, right? So, I tell my dad, well, I'm going down and I'm enlisting. And he goes, hold on. First of all, I'm for sure going to get deployed. Like, we don't know where yet. We don't know for how long, but you know how it is from my previous deployments. I could be gone a year. I could be gone 2 years. I could come back for a month and be gone for another 9. Your sister's still a kid. Your mom is going to be out of her mind already with me over there. It doesn't need to be 2 of us. I promise you, if you want to do this in 3 or 4 years, it'll be there for you. Hang out, watch out. There are other ways to serve your country than to do this. And, I waited a couple of years and saw what happened, in terms of the Iraq war and Afghanistan. And my dad made a good call. Not only because I think it would have been disastrous. Who knows if we both would have come back, but also because I think he saw something that I didn't, which is that you can get caught up in this, rush after an event like 9/11 and not think about where's the war going to be in a year? Like, where geographically is it going to be? How are we going to be waging it? How are you going to feel about that? Who's going to be in charge? If you're going to join the Marine Corps and you're going to go when they call you, you can't care about any of that. You gotta go when they tell you, and not ask so many questions. And I think my dad correctly sensed that not asking so many questions was not going to be my strong suit from having raised me. He kind of got that. But I very nearly did join the Marine Corps. And I think about that all the time, about like that sliding doors situation of like what could have been if I'd done that. And I got even friends who are journalists who did do that. Maybe not right at the same time, but Nick Oshner he's an investigative reporter in Charlotte. Fantastic investigative reporter. One of the co-authors of that book, The Vote Collectors, about the whole McCurry Dowless thing.
Oh yeah.
His wife, Sarah, was a reporter who got embedded with with an army unit, I believe. Went overseas, came back, joined the army. Just got back from not from basic, but from OCS. People do that. People do that. That is a career path.
And you never thought about kind of a military correspondent, or? Well,
I had an opportunity early in my career. I was writing some stories, making a little bit of noise, and a guy came to me and said, I'm with I believe it was the Army is the branch that it was with. We're looking for, now we're still at war at this point. I'm in my early 20s. We're looking for local reporters to embed with units from these areas. And because I know a little bit about your background and that your family was in the military, thought maybe you might be interested in this. Could you talk your employer into either giving you the time off or running correspondence, that you do or whatever? And I loved that idea because it goes back to, like very early journalism. It used to be the Mark Twain, right? When he was a newspaper reporter, they used to send him places just to write letters back. Letters from Hawaii, letters from, before Hawaii was a vacation destination, when it was a place where they were trying to convert the island to Christianity, and I thought, man, I could go over there and be a correspondent. I could do like the Sebastian Younger thing, where you go over and I was really in love with that idea, but there were 2 problems. One was, I was working for the News and Record at the time, and I ran it up the flagpole. I was like, what do you think? And they were like, we're not a military town. We don't know that there's going to be enough interest in this for us to like have a full-time staffer who's in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. So like the best we could probably do is tell you that your job would still be here when you got back, but we couldn't like pay you to do that exclusively.
So what did you study at UNCG?
Poli-sci, political science. Yeah. I was always interested in journalism, but we were in this really interesting situation because, I told you that the longest I ever stayed anywhere when I was a kid was Bristol, Connecticut for 3 years, right? Well, when I was in Bristol, Connecticut, there was a local paper, still exists, remarkably, called the Bristol Press, and they had a program through that paper where they went to high schools, local high schools, and taught kids about journalism. And, taught them about the inverted pyramid and who, where, what, when, why, and taught them to do basic interviews and stuff. And then they would publish on one page every week stories that these kids wrote about things teenagers would be interested in. And it grew into this enormous multinational nonprofit called Youth Journalism International that is still run by two friends and mentors of mine who, when I was a kid, taught me about this stuff. Now they work with teenagers on 6 continents.
So is it like a Teach for America, but focused on journalism?
Well, there's one of those already called Report for America. This thing is specifically about like middle school and high school kids basically learning about journalism and from wherever they are in the world writing about it. So for instance, they had people write, they had a Russian kid writing about and Ukrainian kids writing about the current crisis there, right? When there's like an enormous, they just did this enormous project where kids from, I don't remember how many countries, I think maybe a dozen countries were part of writing about sexual assault in their cultures. So that's very different in a Muslim culture, for instance, than it would be in the United States, than it is in the UK, than it is in Mexico, right? And so they did this enormous project and they win awards just like constantly. It was in its nascent phase when I was part of it. And my wife, who I hasten to say I have not been dating since high school. We had a long Harry and Sally phase where we were best friends but weren't romantic, and then it got romantic later on in our adulthood, in our 30s. But I met her there through that, and she was
which high school? I
was at Bristol Eastern High School. She was at Bristol Central High School. We were at rival schools, and so we met there, became best friends. And she went off to journalism school and I went off and studied poli-sci. And the way that we determined to do that is that we were both interested in journalism, and we were doing enough work through that program that eventually they let us do small stories in the real newspaper, but when we got licenses and we were 18 and stuff. And they, it's like $40 a story, go out and cover a car wreck or whatever, and stringing is what they used to call it. And something that used to be popular, especially at small town newspapers where they don't have a lot of staff. And so we were both interested in what we were going to do for college. Like, what are we going to study? And we went around the newsroom and said, you're a journalist. What did you study? Do you go to journalism school? Do you not go to journalism school? And it was about 50-50. People who said, go to journalism school. That's what I did. And people who said, well, I studied history because I was interested in history. And then I just worked on my student newspaper and I got an internship at a newspaper. You don't always have to study journalism. You can just do journalism. And I was interested in politics, and my wife, her interest was primarily in journalism. So she took that route and I took this route, and we ended up at the same paper about 15 years later.
That's funny.
Yeah. She worked in Massachusetts. She went to Emerson College in Boston, where the new dean of the UNC journalism school just came from. I went to UNCG and I studied poli-sci. I was a reporter and then the editor of the paper there. And then I got internships at a couple of different papers, including the News and Record, and ended up getting my first full-time job there.
Interestingly enough, when I was in junior high, I did a lot of creative writing. And I thought that my career path would be to be a writer, actually, at that time.
Well, thank God you went the other way.
I know, right? And then in high school, I wrote for Grimsley's paper and wrote featured stories for that.
Do you have any of those?
My most popular story was how to get out of a speeding ticket.
You're like the PJ O'Rourke of...
Actually, it's interesting. The first time that someone called me a maverick was my journalism professor in high school.
Hey, that'll do it.
Yeah. So it was funny back then, but she, I wanted to pick the stories that people would find really interesting. And that wasn't just what everybody was covering, a lot of them were just covering mundane stories. And so I wanted something that would really pop out there, and that would typically make the front page. And I guess that kind of carried on in life for me. When I'm promoting my businesses, I try and promote things that will draw attention, that will reach the front page.
Well, it's interesting because I asked if you have any of those old copies of your high school newspaper, because I think that stuff is like worth its weight in gold. I got friends who have like copies of their old high school. I got some copies of my old college newspaper, but you'd be surprised how relevant that stuff remains. I was just, it was this week. It was on Monday. I went over to UNCG and I saw Ben Shapiro speak at the Fleming.
I was there as well.
Oh, really? So yeah. So there were like 2,000 plus people. I was told it was, the capacity was 2,050. I was told, and they cut it off. So it had to be at least that many people.
It was really organized too.
Well, this is what they do. Yes, that group is very good at this. Like Shapiro's people, but also the Young Americans Foundation or Young Americans for Freedom, the same thing. Like they bring speakers to college campuses, and very often they're controversial speakers, and they know what that's going to be. So they set this up with. It's very, very professional. But I remember that when I talk about Mavericks, so when I was at UNCG, a couple of the big speaking controversies, I was kind of at the center of them because I was the editor of the newspaper in that period, and the school brought it's like so
you were the editor of the newspaper at UNCG?
Yeah, the Carolinian.
And you weren't a journalism major?
There was no journalism major at UNCG. They don't have a journalism program. Yeah. So like they still have a newspaper. I'm pretty sure they still have one. They had one then. It was a weekly. It was like I was competing with journalism majors. I was competing with English majors, and they wanted to write poetry. So while I was there, the school brought, nobody remembers this anymore, but you can look it up. The school brought a woman in for, like a safe sex week kind of a thing they were doing. And her name was Tristan Taormino, and she was a columnist for the Village Voice. She had written books. She gives college tours. She went on Oprah. She had lectured at like Brown and, Yale and stuff, about like safe sex stuff. But she was also like, heavily into like kink and LGBTQ stuff, right? She didn't mention any of that stuff in her actual speech. Her whole speech was like, here's why you should use a condom. Here's a funny illustration of why you should use a condom. Here's some stuff about your body that you should be aware of. It's good to know your body, stuff like that. People got mad, right? They got so mad. And particularly conservatives on campus were incensed, not only that this is a woman who had written what they thought were dirty books and all this stuff, but it turns out, people should know this. Tristan had appeared in and co-directed some pornography, like as part of her whole, sex ed thing. This was like, better, safer sex practices stuff. And they were so mad about it. Right. And, so nothing illegal has happened, right? This is just a controversial person who's come to campus and didn't even really say anything that controversial, but people are very mad, right? It's the left right now with Ben Shapiro. They're mad at him coming, right? And then it was the right, and the school reacted, I think, in the worst possible way, which is the chancellor, then her name was Patty Sullivan back then. She put out the statement. She was like, well, I didn't know that this was who they had coming, and nobody like that should speak on this campus. And I got mad because I didn't have a dog in the fight. I didn't know Tristan Taormino. I didn't really know her work that much or anything, but I did know that I'd been at the talk because people have been talking about it. And so I knew that there was nothing in the talk that was any more controversial than the 8th grade sex ed stuff that I'd gotten in Carteret County, North Carolina. Right. So I was like, what are you so upset about? It's like, well, she did pornography. I'm like, that's legal in this country. It's been adjudicated. What's your next argument? And they didn't have one. They just didn't like her on spec. Right. So I said that.
What year was this?
This was 2004, I believe.
Well, they should see what's at a lot of the schools now. Yeah.
So I said, that's screwy. Like it's bad that the university is on the side of trying to censor this person sort of on spec, not even for what she said. So we invited her back. The newspaper and I think a couple of other groups got together and called her up and said, how'd you like to come back? But this time talk about why you did pornography, why you do pornography, like why you think that's a good thing, why you think a feminist pornographer is a thing. Like, people seem so excited about it now. They were excited about it when you weren't even talking about that. Why don't you come back and actually talk about it? So she did. And like,
so Joe Killian, the provocateur in college.
My mother would tell you this goes back to 4th grade. But so, yeah, so we invited her back, and she came back, and we packed out this enormous ballroom in the Elliott University Center, which then was like a new thing on campus. And people came. There was a spot on Bill O'Reilly about it. People were like mad. They showed up, and people were, but this is the difference, right? So over the course of my time at UNCG, people were mad about that. They were mad about Tristan. They were mad when Maureen Dowd came, right? That's conservatives. They were mad when Mike Adams, I don't know if you remember Mike Adams, controversial UNC Wilmington professor, he came and a couple of times and talked there. Liberals are mad about that, right? Nobody threw anything. I don't even remember anybody like picketing or disrupting. I mean, Tristan gave her whole thing about why I'm a feminist pornographer, and nobody yelled anything. Nobody threw anything. Nobody chanted. Nobody sang any songs. They showed up and rubbernecked because they were interested, and some of them were mad, and they gave quotes about how they were mad, and it was sick and disgusting and all this stuff. But the whole thing went off without a hitch. All of those. Angela Davis came to UNCG when I was there and spoke, and people were like,
that was similar to the Ben Shapiro event. It was pretty tame.
The Angela Davis thing, you mean?
Well, no, I'm saying in terms of you didn't have a lot of major problems there.
They threw some people out. I mean,
but you didn't have like fights break out.
No. But what I think was really smart, though, it was very interesting.
They did the competing event.
They did the competing event.
That was smart.
And, I thought to myself, the dumbest thing you can do if you don't like Ben Shapiro is throw a bunch of gas on this fire. Show up, scream, wave signs. It's not like nobody did that, but largely they just went and had a dance party on the other side of campus, right? They were like, why would we go over there? And I thought that is such a smart, mature reaction to a thing you don't like. There's a thing I don't like happening over there. Therefore, I'm not going to go over there. I'm going to go over here to a thing I like better. Right. And when I talked with the, I say kids and sound like I'm 100 years old, but when I talked to the students there who were at the event, I went over after the Shapiro thing, talk with them a little bit. They were like really bright, mature. They were like, yeah, why would we go over there? We got no, it's like, well, you could go over and protest. And they're like, or we could be here with people that we like and, talking about stuff we like. Like, those are your options. I mean, there's a C between those two things, but those are your options. And that's the weird thing. It's like we talk a lot about like civil discourse now. And is there a problem with free speech on campuses and stuff? I always tell people this story. When I was in like 8th grade, maybe not even 8th grade. So I think I was like 12 years old. I got to that point in your young development as a young man where I started having strong opinions and voicing strong opinions. And my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and she said, let me tell you this. It's a free country. You can say whatever you want, but what you say and how you say it will always have consequences. Sometimes that consequence will just be people will think you're an asshole. And they won't want to talk to you anymore. And they won't want to listen to you anymore. Right. So just know that going in, you can say whatever you want, but the consequence could be X, Y, Z. You don't know what it will be, but maybe it will be nobody wants to listen to or talk to you anymore. Go with God. Right. And so my mother was not a political philosopher or an academic or a politician. She was, for most of my life, she was a bartender. She was a hairdresser. She worked in a dental lab and made teeth. She was like a blue collar person, but she explained to me at that point, the difference between what we now call cancel culture, right? And actual censorship. When the government moves against you and tries to do something to limit your speech, that's censorship. When people hear what you say and they think that's an asshole, I don't want to talk to him or listen to him anymore, that's cancel culture. That's people going, the consequence for your speech is I cancel my subscription to Spotify if you're Joe Rogan, or I don't go to your concert, I don't go to your movie, I think you're an asshole, right?
Versus in Russia or China being gathered up and sent to a prison or killed.
Or even in this country. I mean, let's not act like there's no government censorship in this country. We're banning books in schools right now, and not just like the, this LGBTQ book or whatever, just books that they think are, not on the square for high school anymore. Stuff that I had to read in high school, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we should ever ban books. I've got, the back of my artist loft is a Fahrenheit 451 mural there. And I worry about that sometimes with cancel culture and with the idea of saying you can't think or say these things. You can't read this book. You can't publish this book. You can't have this speaker. But I do think there's certain age appropriate levels that we don't just, we don't throw porn into the school library,
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we call community standards. I mean, when I was at UNCG, they had what was called the UNCG Media Board, right? And this was a group of people. Jerry Rowe was on this board, former columnist for the News and Record and journalist. A group of people who would look at the college newspaper and decide, is this okay? Do we have problems with it, right? And since the college was kicking in money for the production of the newspaper, they got a say. So when I became editor of the paper, I had to go before this board every now and then, and they would have a question about, why did you do this? Why did you say that? Why did this word get used? And what I would always say to them if they had some question about content, like if there was a 4-letter word in the newspaper, and they'd be like, well, don't you think this is inappropriate? And I said, no, and neither does the law. If you go downstairs from this building, that we're in the building right now, and you go down to the bookstore, you're going to find magazines and papers and things that have those words in them. We've established that that's a community standards thing that's been adjudicated. Next question. It might not be to your taste. I recommend you not pick it up. I assure you, everybody who's between the ages of 18 and 21 has heard these words before. They've seen these things before, and they'll be fine. And all that happened was we had a great student newspaper. It was very well read. We won awards. So I agree with you that there's like community standards, but I also think that you have to be wary of making the community standard the most conservative possible rendition of this, right? Like Ben Shapiro, I was actually pretty impressed with that, not only with the way that the event was carried out, but also by the way he handled himself. Like, I disagree with almost everything he said, he and I don't agree on many, if any, political issues. But one of the things that was impressive to me is that he kept his cool. When people screamed profanity at him, he had a joke ready, because if you do this often enough, people scream at you, and you have some jokes ready, and all of that. But also that when, the thing that hit me is that I understand where he's coming from, because if I was a conservative Orthodox Jew like Ben Shapiro is, and is open about that informing his social and political philosophy, I also would be upset with some things in the culture. But I don't think that we can have a culture wherein the majority is dictated to by the religious and social taboos of the most conservative. Neither should the people who are, the most out there be deciding, you know what I mean? So that's, I think that's also where the Constitution is. So I'm not alone in that, but that is the thing that always bothers me. It's like that Tristan Taormino example I gave, right? It's like, if you don't like Tristan Taormino's book, don't read it. If you don't like her movies, don't watch them, right? I think that's an adult response at a place that is, nobody here is under 18. Everybody here can legally read or watch any of this stuff or choose not to. Like, when you treat people like children, that's.
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to people want a punching bag. Yeah. They want an enemy. They, and when they can vilify someone and demonize them, then at that point they feel like they can do or say anything, like the guy that was commenting on Ben Shapiro's sister. And so I
might have missed that. What?
Yeah, that's actually a big trolling thing they do.
Did they do that at the event and I just missed it? Or?
Yeah, they did it at the event.
Oh, see, a lot of that I couldn't hear because the acoustics weren't great. Sorry about that.
It was hard to hear.
Yeah.
And actually, they've got
The gymnasium,
they've got a recording of it.
I saw,
So it's an hour recording, and on that, you can hear a lot more of what was said. I had the same issue. I couldn't hear some of what they were saying.
Plus, he speaks really fast. People say I speak fast. Nothing is compared to Ben Shapiro.
Yeah. I found it hard to sit there and listen. If I were sitting there giving his 20-minute speech, it probably would have been an hour.
Yeah.
Because he was so fast. But I did appreciate that he made it through all that kind of canned speech. And he had some elements that weren't, but most of it was, stuff he said before.
Yeah.
But then when he got to the Q&A, he had to think on his feet about every single question that was asked. And actually, I was talking to Mark Walker the other day, and that's one of the things that concerns me when politicians, and I won't name names, politicians won't show up and go to a debate, because then it shows that maybe they can't think on their feet.
That's not everybody's strength. Although I will say this, over the course of the last, 3 or 4 years, I have been asked to do more public speaking. I've spoken at the journalism school at UNC. I spoke at Duke not that long ago, 2 weeks ago. Next week, I'm going to talk to a journalism class at San Francisco State University. I am moderating a panel at the Greensboro Bound Book Festival, the literary festival. And it's just become a bigger part of what I do. And I remember years ago going to Elon University and seeing Ben Bradley, the sort of legendary editor of the Washington Post during the Watergate saga. He had a canned speech. He had kind of note cards or whatever, but he got to the podium and he realized he left his glasses at the hotel, and he went, damn, I left my glasses at the hotel. Let's just do questions. Questions are the best part anyway. Let's just do questions. And he did questions for an hour. Right. And he was thinking on his feet, but what was true of Ben Bradley is also true of Ben Shapiro, and is becoming true of me too, which is if you speak in front of enough crowds and you do enough Q&A, you kind of know what's coming. People are going to ask you the same questions over and over again. You will have had time to think about it. Some people will be rude. Some people will be fawning, and you'll be able to react to it. I do think that Ben Shapiro handled the Q&A part particularly well, much better than the canned speech part, because he spoke so quickly. But the other thing that I had two other thoughts. I thought, number one, this is a guy who has a lot of experience doing this. He's done a lot of these dates. He's done a lot of them at colleges. The other thing is, it's real easy to look like you're 7 feet tall when you're playing against third graders. You know what I mean? 19-year-old kids were getting up and saying things, and he was dunking on them. And I'm like, yeah, you can do that when you're, my age, which he is, and you went to Harvard, which I did not, you coming in and intellectually dominating a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds is real impressive.
Anyone could have attended the event.
Yeah, for sure.
Send up your best to kind of, right. You could have gone up and asked a question as well.
Yeah.
But I don't know that
I don't know that I would, just because I don't have questions for Ben Shapiro. I recognize that his worldview is very different from mine. And I also think that if I had been raised in the environment that he was raised in, I might have that worldview.
But didn't you find his Trump comment surprising? I was surprised.
No.
I was actually very pleased to hear it.
Yeah. For people who didn't hear this or didn't go and watch the video, he said that he thinks it would be a mistake for the GOP to nominate Trump because he comes with, I believe he said, a 747 full of baggage. Exactly. And that instead they should, and it would
become a referendum on Trump.
Right. And that if it's a referendum
on Biden.
Exactly. And the only way that you do that is to send somebody new. So then it's a referendum on Biden. And he suggested it should be DeSantis from Florida, which is now Ben Shapiro's home state. And I thought that was a very smart comment, but I didn't expect him to make a stupid comment about that for two reasons. One is that everybody knows there's kind of a civil war happening or domestic disturbance happening within the Republican Party right now. And people like Ben Shapiro, who skipped 2 grades in school and then went to Harvard Law School, right? Those are not the favorite conservatives of people who love Donald Trump. You know what I mean? If you go to a Trump rally, I don't feel like they're there for the sparkling wit. They're not there for Trump's ability to, as Ben Shapiro did, call up data from studies and give you percentages of suicide risk and things like that. Trump's not going to do that. He's going to say dumb, offensive things, and people are going to go, USA, USA. That's been his shtick all along.
Have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
Oh, yes.
So it's
Absolutely.
like that when they're going in and they're using all the just easy jabs.
Yeah.
And I think, that red meat, the easy jabs are, both sides. Like
When in 2016, I was at the News and Record and a daily newspaper, and I got sent to the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. They sent a different reporter from the Winston-Salem Journal, sort of the sister paper, to the Republican National Convention. And when I was there was this enormous tension in Philadelphia over what's Bernie going to do, right? Because Bernie had some delegates, right? And those delegates wanted Bernie and nobody but Bernie. I'm sure that that's true right now if you talk to a bunch of them, right? And so I talked to some of them at the hotels and at the convention, and they were like, nah, it's got to be Bernie. It's got to be Bernie. By then, everybody knew it was Hillary Clinton, right? So, including Bernie Sanders. And I got invited to this breakfast where Bernie Sanders was going to address his delegates. It was this breakfast, and he got up there and he said, my friends, it's not going to be me this year. It's going to be Hillary Clinton, and we have to unite as a party and defeat Donald Trump, right? And they booed him.
Pretty good impression.
They booed him. They booed their own guy. They booed him, right? And they were mad. And the same thing happened later on when Bernie Sanders did an online event with Joe Biden and said, guys, it's going to be Joe Biden. We got to stop Trump, and if you look in I just took a picture. I took a picture of this when it happened, and it came up today. So it was like today, 4 years ago or whatever in Facebook. No, more years ago than that now. But the comments on the side were Bernie supporters being like, boo, no, never Biden, like all this stuff. And so it's like, I don't think that either ethically or morally or politically, I don't think that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are equivalent. But I don't much like either of them. And I don't much like either of the people who are really into them. I had to go to a bunch of Trump rallies during that period when he came through North Carolina. Pretty much every time he came through North Carolina, wherever it was, we were going. Hillary Clinton rallies. I had to go to Bernie Sanders rallies. And I can tell you that I had the worst time at Trump rallies and Bernie Sanders rallies. The Bernie Sanders people were really media hostile. When we showed up at I think it was the Duke Energy Center, for a thing there, they didn't have any provision for media at all. There was no media table. There was no media hookup. You couldn't get Wi-Fi. They were just like, I don't know, find a seat. And I was like, well, you see how that's a little difficult because this guy's got an enormous camera because he's a television reporter. And I also am going to have to write this while it's happening. And they were like, yeah, you're not special, whatever. Right. That was how they dealt with the media. During that 2016 campaign, I had to cover all that stuff. And I remember I went to this Hillary Clinton event in Durham, and it was at this traditionally black high, might have been Hillside High School. I'm trying to remember the name of the high school. This like traditionally black high school that she was at. And there were these questions that reporters and, Democrats on the ground had for Bernie Sanders, which is like, why, when you come through here, are you going to the Greensboro Coliseum? Why don't you go to, some black neighborhood? You're not doing very well with black people in the South. And I had one of his surrogates, one of the people from his campaign, say to my face, "We don't like to pander like that. We don't have to do that. She has to do that. We don't have to do that." Right? I'm like, yeah, you don't have to win either. Like, that's not a foregone conclusion. You got to come through and speak to the constituencies you're not doing that well with, and you're not doing that. And
Mark Walker had a great comment the other day also, where he was saying, he was talking about why he spends time in different areas. Mm-hmm. And his feeling was, if you're comfortable with your message, why wouldn't you go out and talk to other people and have that dialogue and learn what they're thinking, and in turn, tell them what you're thinking in a conversational, non-threatening way.
Yeah. You also got to have the skills, though. That's the thing.
Yeah. There's some people that don't have that, where, they want to be in their echo chamber. They can't handle conflict, or when they do, it just becomes like, well, let me just beat them up and just be very aggressive.
100%.
And it takes a different skill set to find that common ground. Or like with Ben Shapiro, I think he found some common ground with people, but he also was just kind of, doing a little fencing and dancing around them.
Yeah. There's with Ben Shapiro, what strikes me is he's obviously a really smart guy who really has rhetorical skills. And if he was interested in building bridges, he might be able to build bridges. I think he's primarily interested in like being right and being a provocateur. I mean, you could also get up there and say all the things he said about transgender people and how you think that they're mentally ill and that they're potential child molesters and all this stuff. You can say all of that stuff if you wanted to, and also figure out the best possible way to put a spin on that would get some people who are in the middle or not so sure or whatever. But instead he gets up there and he makes jokes about the LGBTQ plus minus divided ampersand community and, and all this stuff. And when he meets transgender woman, he calls her sir, right? Like that shit. And it's like, that's like, he's interested in offending people, A, because he thinks those people should be offended, and B, because he knows people who like him will love that shit. Right.
Now, I was surprised when someone asked him basically, why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. And his answer was, he said, it's one of the more controversial topics out there. And if you say basically the things he's saying, you could be canceled or trolled out there. Mm-hmm.
As evidenced by how canceled he's been, as evidenced by how canceled Dave Chappelle has been, as evidenced by how canceled Mel Gibson has been, as evidenced by,
Well, but I think for most people it would be, right? I mean,
most people
anybody. So let's say you started making these comments out there. I think, you might get canceled pretty quickly and not have a job in reporting.
Let's interrogate that. What do we mean by cancel? Do you mean that I'd lose my job at Policy Watch?
Well, or possibly in journalism overall.
There are people who work for Carolina Journal right now who say that shit. Like,
okay. Yes. Well, you'd have to.
Right. Or I could work for the Daily Wire. I could, if I'm Dennis Miller, for instance, a name to conjure with at this point, but a real big comedian of my youth. Right. And I undergo a political transformation where now I'm saying a bunch of conservative stuff that I wouldn't have said 5 years ago. Do I get canceled? Dennis Miller's doing fine. He's doing different things, but he's doing fine. He's still a millionaire. He can still sell out wherever he plays. Dave Chappelle gets up and says his shit on Netflix, right? Yeah. What do? They pay him tens of millions of dollars and they give him another special. He wins awards. People give him standing ovations.
Or South Park.
South Park. Sure.
How many different groups is South Park offended?
Absolutely. Yeah. So like when we say canceled, I always ask people, like, honestly, not because I'm trying to be an asshole. What do you mean by that? Like, what is the real consequence of saying a controversial thing? It's what my mother said to me when I was 12 years old, right? Some people might think you're an asshole. They might not want to listen to you anymore, and they might not want to talk to you anymore. But you know who's going to want to listen to and talk to you? The people who agree with that stuff. And that's an enormous audience. Joe Rogan is doing fine. So Neil Young is mad at him? Who gives a shit? Did I cancel my Spotify subscription? I did. Do they care? No, absolutely not. Let me go to Tidal. You know why? Joe Rogan's got the biggest podcast audience of anybody, right? Or I'm trying to think of the other examples Ben Shapiro is a great example, right? I mean, like, that's his shtick. That's his audience or whatever. But is he playing to niche audiences? No. He's writing New York Times best-selling books. He's got an enormous podcast. His YouTube channel's got like 4 million subscribers. He's got almost 4 million Twitter followers, right? He's doing fine. I'm not,
Yeah, and I do think, there's some people out there that have used this. They're, again, a provocateur to an extreme, and they're saying things to really just rile up the other side out there. I think most of us, myself included, are more hospitable and don't go out there, each day thinking, how can I piss somebody off or really go after them? And to the extent I can accommodate someone, then I certainly want to. And I don't, I wouldn't choose if someone identified a certain way and they wanted me to speak to them in a certain manner. I don't have any problem with that. It doesn't hurt me one bit.
Right. So, good for you.
I can do that, or I can accommodate someone in a different way. And it's, I think there are certain civilities out there that can be afforded. And I think some of the civilities, both on the right and the left, are going away. And it's just hostilities.
What was your family like growing up? You grew up around here, right?
Yeah. So
were they conservative, or was there
my
mix?
My grandfather's from Greece, from Saloniki.
KOTIS. There we go.
KOTIS. Yeah. Got shortened pretty substantially when he came over. Was in the restaurant business, and my dad went to high school, did not go to college. My mom went through college at UNCG and master's program, as an accompanist.
Back when it was the women's college, I'll bet.
Yeah. And, and she taught some at A&T. She was one of the founders of the Music Academy in North Carolina. And so I've had a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds around me. You think some of my close friends in junior high were Ken Jeong, the comedian, was a good friend of mine, and James Cheek. And so I've always surrounded myself with people that I like, and it doesn't matter their demographic or their financial status. It's just, do I think they're nice people to be with?
I think if you're lucky enough to come up that way, it's an enormous advantage, because when I was a kid, I didn't always feel like it was an advantage. So I grew up in most of my young life in Eastern North Carolina, right? I always like to say, I grew up in trailer parks. I grew up on military bases, and I grew up in trailer parks that were on military bases. That's where we lived. And, my mother's people were commercial fishermen and Navy folks, some of them virulent racists, who were from down East North Carolina, and they don't want any dark people in that area, and are open about it. And there's a picture of my grandfather, who I loved dearly and miss every day, in his Navy uniform when he's a young man, surrounded by other white people holding up a Confederate flag on their Navy base. And he did not attend and would not attend my mother's marriage to my dad because he's Puerto Rican, right? And my family, when I was growing up, is such a mix of things. There are Puerto Rican people, there are white people, there are Dominican people, there are black people, there are gay people, there are trans people, there are straight people, there are religious people, there are atheists. Growing up in that environment at the time did not feel like an advantage, because I literally would have kids use the N-word about my family at school, and I would just have to put up with it, and parts of my family didn't get along. That my dad's Puerto Rican family did not like my mother because she was white. Didn't want their kids marrying white people, right? Of course, they were also Puerto Rican and didn't want their kids marrying Dominican people, and some of them married into Dominican families. But it's just like, it was a constant roiling conversation and conflict about identity and politics. There were people who were strong Republicans, people who were Democrats, people who didn't really have a political affiliation, probably didn't vote their entire lives, and growing up like that, I think was an enormous help for me being a reporter, because when I talk to somebody like Mark Walker, who I've had to talk to many, many times, like, he and I have political differences, and we might have religious differences and things like that. Doesn't bother me. I grew up with that my whole life. I could sit down and have dinner with Ben Shapiro tomorrow, right? We disagree strongly. I mean, my best friend is a trans person. I got trans people in my family. He thinks that they're mentally ill and that they shouldn't, they're part of a social contagion, and, and all this stuff. I could sit down and have a meal with him tomorrow, no problem, and talk about all sorts of other things. But there are two things at play here. One is that I was raised in a really diverse, family and environment, and I experienced that conflict growing up, and I'm not afraid of it. The other thing is it's low stakes for me because I'm not a trans person.
Yeah. And I think also, when you're in a sheltered environment or in a bubble out there, whether it's a certain background you came from or another, and you only are exposed to one viewpoint, I think that's a problem, because then you aren't comfortable being around other viewpoints and having that discussion. I think two things make people comfortable in potentially contentious situations. One, they can have a level of civility and have some manners around other people, and not just jump to, they disagree with me, let's go slap them in the face, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second is they're knowledgeable about their topic. And so they don't feel that, I think sometimes when people don't know enough about something, that's when they jump to quick jabs and base insults instead of, debating the topic, because if you know what you're talking about, then you can have that conversation. You're not rattled.
I think that's true.
By it. But when you have when you're not exposed to a lot of different viewpoints, then when you're around something new, and if you're around viewpoints where they vilify someone with a different view, I think that just results in more of this conflict out there. And that's one of the reasons that I'm concerned in the university system right now, that we're
there's a resistance, like Brian Clary writing an article saying Ben Shapiro shouldn't come to campus because
I think that was Sayaka.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, they published that. Yeah.
So, attacking a speaker for coming and saying, we don't want a different viewpoint here. What they're saying is violence. Well, no, it's not. I mean, there are words that incite violence, and then there's things that you disagree with that you say it could be harmful to someone's psyche if they're saying that. And I get that some people could take what he's saying and say that could result in trans folks having a more difficult path or not being accepted as much. So I get that part of it. I wasn't a huge fan of that whole line of commentary. I'm not standing up clapping about those sorts of things, but that's not really my bent. I'm more, fiscal conservative and libertarian. In my mind, if people want to live their lives however they want to live their lives, great. Don't infringe on mine, and I don't want to infringe on yours.
Sure. Yeah. And it's like, I know Sayaka a little bit. We're not like best friends or anything, but she went to UNCG. I went to UNCG. We're years apart. Obviously, she's much younger than I am. And when I read that, I had two thoughts. I don't agree with this. Like, I don't agree that the university, for practical reasons and also for philosophical reasons, I don't think the university should have prevented him from speaking on campus. First of all, I don't think that they can. Like, they would be in enormous legal trouble if they said, because of your political viewpoint, we would like to not have you on campus. We're going to bar you from being on campus. I mean, that's been adjudicated. That's not on the table anymore. Like,
and fortunately, most of the UNC schools right now are a green rating from fire.
Yeah.
And probably I think there's only 3 that are yellow that are all working towards green. So,
right.
That's a great thing in my opinion. I don't have to agree with what someone else says.
Yeah.
But at least I'm not going to go worry about trying to shut them down.
But the interesting thing about that is when I read what Sayaka had to write in Triad City Beat about Ben Shapiro, I thought, I don't agree with this. I didn't agree with it when I was at UNCG. Like, what happened when I was at UNCG is when people were upset about Tristan Taormino, I thought, how silly, why don't you come and listen to what she has to say? And when Mike Adams came, and people were upset about Mike Adams being there, I said, how silly, why don't you come and see what he has to say? Which I did. I sat through Mike Adams's lecture. I talked to him afterward. And that's kind of the same way I felt about Ben Shapiro. It's like, because I've heard bits of him and seen him on television and read things he's written, I had a strong sense of what he had to say. And it wasn't like I was like, I wonder what this is going to be. I kind of knew what it was going to be. But it's different to go there and see the people who are there, see why they're there. I described the audience as diverse on Twitter, and people got mad because they're like, look at these pictures. It's mostly white people. And I was like, yeah, it is mostly white people, but it's diverse in terms of age. It's diverse in terms of ideology, because I stuck around and talked to people, and there were a bunch of people who were like, I don't agree with anything this guy said, but I had to come and listen. Right. And people who were like, he's great, we love him. Right. Like, that's a type of diversity. And it was actually more racially diverse than I thought it was going to be. I mean, like, I would say, like, I don't know, I wouldn't want to be wrong about this, but a number of the speakers who got up there and asked him questions were black. Right. And I thought this could be an all white room very easily. Right. And so, like, it was more diverse than I was expecting it to be, but that's also because not everybody who was there to support him. There were people who were there for the reasons that you go to things in college, because it's different, because you want to get exposed to something else, because perhaps you want to see how the enemy thinks, and
I do think some of the people that attended, clearly weren't in favor of what he was saying.
Yeah.
And I think you read that so let's say someone was in favor of what he's saying, they were clapping.
Mm-hmm.
If they weren't in favor, maybe they weren't clapping. But then also when he was speaking about something he disagreed with, then those that agreed with that particular item would clap on that to show that they were part of this divergent thinking from what he was putting forward. And I thought that was a very respectful way to communicate that there were a couple hundred people in there that felt differently.
Right.
And were clapping when most of the people weren't clapping because, he was citing some other viewpoint.
Another thing that separates a guy like Ben Shapiro from a guy like Trump, I mean, one of them not run for office. That helps. Right. But is that there was this moment, I don't know if you remember, a guy got up who was clearly a Ben Shapiro fan. He was there and agreeing with him on most everything. He got up and he said, there are these people who are pro-abortion and they're bragging about killing babies, and they're just bragging all, they're like, I killed a baby. And Ben Shapiro stopped him and he was like, first of all, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like I think that if you are hearing anybody saying I'm bragging about killing a baby, that must be an extreme minority, because people who are having abortions, which I'm against, they've been convinced it's not murder. They've been convinced they're not killing anything, that it's a collection of cells or whatever. And that's how he dealt with that question. I'm on the same page you are. I'm against abortion. However, your assertion about these people who are pro-choice is incorrect. And that reminded me of that famous moment with John McCain, when John McCain was running for president, and this old woman gets up at his rally and says, "I'm worried about Barack Obama. He's a what did she say? Terrorist, or he's a Muslim or something like that." And he goes, "No, ma'am. No, he's a good family man. He's a nice person. He and I just have some political differences. Thank you very much." Takes the mic away from her, right? No way Trump does that. No way Trump does that. He does not tell that guy that he's wrong about people bragging about killing babies. In fact, Trump is probably like, "I know, and it's terrible," right?
Yeah,
those awful people. In no way he corrects anybody saying a nasty thing about Barack Obama, whether it's correct or not. He doesn't do that, right? So, like, I think that Ben Shapiro's intellectual honesty in that moment, there are things about which I think Ben Shapiro is not particularly intellectually honest, but in that moment, I think he recognized that it's going to be bad for me, bad for my position, bad for everybody if I let this person say this thing that clearly isn't true. We're taping it tomorrow. People are going to go, "What thing? Why did Ben Shapiro allow that to happen? Why didn't he disagree with it or whatever?" So he wins some points with people who are, maybe not on his exact page, by at least saying the craziness that you're saying is not accurate. Here's the accurate thing you should be saying in order to be anti-abortion and win.
And I think he also acknowledged when people were asking him questions where they were disagreeing with him, if they had a valid point, he conceded that rather than pushing back on everything that they said.
Right.
And again, I think that's just more intellectual honesty. I don't view it as strategic or marketing wise. I think he's just intellectually honest. And if he feels a certain way, he's not going to change his thinking because of what somebody else has just said in order to win them over.
Well, he's not going to change his thinking even if the American Medical Association or the American Psychiatric Association disagrees with him. So he's certainly not going to be swayed by some boob who gets up in the audience and says a dumb thing. Absolutely. But I think that people who are, it's back to what you said. Like, if you have confidence in your worldview, and if you have confidence in your intellect, and you have confidence in your knowledge of something, you're a lot less likely to just go with the flow or get defensive or do a dumb thing that will make you look like you're less in control when you're giving a speech, answering a question, things like that. I mean, the other thing is, and this is like, I think a thing journalism has taught me over and over again, which makes it a healthy thing for me, journalism. There's a lot of shit I don't know. There's a lot of shit I don't know. And some of it is stuff that I don't know because I'm not particularly learned in those areas. Some of it is stuff that I don't know because I probably should know that, but I don't know it yet. And not knowing is the first step to knowing.
I agree. Now, I think it's important. The most important word someone can say is, "I don't know," when they're having a discussion, because then that's being honest. When people try and fake it,
right,
then you're like, well, this person's a bullshitter. And, if they're going to bullshit on that, then they're going to bullshit on everything else too. Right. So I think acknowledging when you don't know something or you're not the expert, and also being open to other ideas. And also changing your mind. Yeah, changing your mind. Years ago, I saw Bill Maher, and Bill, I got problems with Bill Maher, of course, too. But one of the things that I remember him saying that really stuck with me was, when in this country did it become such a bad thing to change your mind? If you're a politician now and you're in a different, you're in a different place on a political issue than you were 10 years ago, good for you. You know what I mean? Who wants to be the same person they were when they were 20 years old on anything, right? But if you change your mind on, any number of things that are political doctrine, or even small points of trade policy or whatever in this country, there are attack ads and you're being told that you're a hypocrite. Well, look at this video from 20 years ago where he said the opposite thing. Yeah. You know what happened in the meantime? 20 years passed. That's a crazy thing. I think about my own mother. She killed herself some years back. Oh gosh. Yeah. And she had mental health struggles, and but one of the things that I was really proud of my mother for over the course of her life was she came a long way on
gay and lesbian and transgender people. And her sister is a lesbian. My sister, who is her daughter, is a lesbian. There are transgender people and gay people who she loves dearly who are in our family, but her position was in her younger years, and by younger years, I don't mean when she was a teenager, I mean when I was a kid, was like, they're sinners and they're backward and it's a problem, but we're going to try and love them anyway. Right. And it came to, I love you. I love that you love this person. I've watched this relationship that you have with this person last for years and years and years while I myself have gotten divorced, while other people have gotten divorced. You're raising healthy children together who turn into stellar adults. And I acknowledge that. And that's wonderful. And but it took her years and decades to get there, but she got there. She moved. And I think that, demonizing that, turning, like, I had experiences, I met people, I thought about things, the society changed a little bit, and I decided maybe I was wrong 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, is okay. It's laudable. I'm not where I was on any number of political issues when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. Now, unfortunately, I was writing columns back then, so you can look them up and see how wrong I was. But that's what Lou Reed called growing up in public. But I'm not embarrassed about any of that, because I wouldn't want to be the person I was when I was 21 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, speaking of Susan King and Hussman and the journalism school, that has been a huge part of your reporting over the last year.
Yeah.
And so, there's some parts of that I can't talk about because I'm on the board of trustees and there's still threatened legal action out there. But just in general, and I didn't join the board of trustees until July 1, which was after all of this had been somewhat resolved. But I was in there watching the antics on the 30th.
You were at that final meeting, right?
Yeah. Observing everything. And, that whole thing, it just feels like there could have been steps that were taken earlier on that could have avoided a lot of this. And
top to bottom.
We'll place a little bit of blame on Susan King on that too, because I think there are things that she could have done as well. You've got in the different cast of characters out there, you have Mr. Hussman, who was generous and gave $20 million to the school.
Pledged $25 million. Yep.
Or pledged $25 million. And also was very interested in supporting the school and conveying his values that I guess show up in his paper, all of his papers, kind of a list of journalistic core values, and had communicated that to the school. And I guess when he was doing all that, they must have bought into that, right? I mean, I don't think he gave the money and they said no.
Well, it's interesting because I get into this a little bit with Susan King in the piece that I just wrote. So Hussman's core values are a staple of the newspapers that he owns in Arkansas and other states. All of his company's papers print this core values statement. And as part of the donor agreement for his pledge of $25 million, he got a few things. One is it's now called the Hussman School, UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. The other is he wanted that value statement etched in stone on the wall of the school. And they agreed to that. Now, nowhere.
And was Susan part of those?
Yes, she signed the donor agreement. She agreed to that. Yes. And was very happy to, because that's the largest gift that school has ever gotten. Right. And also, it should be said, Walter Hussman is an alum of UNC's journalism school, and very connected to it, and always has been, and has been a big supportive, donor and an alum. You're an alum of UNC yourself, Chapel Hill.
I am, yeah. In Flagler School, and Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Nikole Hannah-Jones went to the J School for her master's. That's right. And so, what he got was, you will etch this in stone on the wall of the journalism school. And they said, yes, we'd be happy to do that. We have We have in the Carroll Hall in the journalism school, we have multiple displays of journalism statements and the First Amendment and Pulitzers that people have won and things from our alumni, and we'd be happy to do that. Now, what didn't happen was that the school itself, the journalism school, said, these are our values. That is not a vote that was taken or a statement that was made, but Walter Hussman decided that that is what had happened. And he went on television and said so on Tucker Carlson's show. He wrote op-eds. He said, they have adopted my values. Those are the values of the school. This came as an enormous surprise to the faculty and the students and the people who make up the school, who were like, really, did we? And if you read that value statement, I actually think it's a really good value statement, right? There's not a whole lot in there that I would disagree with or quibble with in any way. I think it's a little too long. And as a newsman myself, I think it could use some editing. But the problem with that value statement is twofold. One, it's that Hussman decided and willed into being that those are not just the values that he espouses, and because of his generous donation, they're on the wall in his alma mater. He's decided that those are the values of the school and has publicly said so. The other thing that is sort of a problem is that Hussman defines those values. He interprets those values in a very specific way, which is to say that when he talks about, he doesn't use the word objectivity. He likes the word, why is it escaping me? But it's essentially objectivity. He says that you should be, you should have a journalistic distance from these matters.
Journalistic integrity.
Well, integrity is different, I think, because integrity is about honesty and keeping your word and all of that. What he's saying is you should stand outside of conflict. You should stand outside of public conflict. You shouldn't make statements about political things. And when I worked at the News and Record, that was also the case at the News and Record. If you worked at the News and Record as a reporter, you were not allowed to put a bumper sticker on your car. You're not allowed to give to political candidates. You're not allowed to put a sign in your yard, right? And I never had any problem with that because I'm not the kind of guy anyway. You're not going to find any bumper stickers on my car, even for bands I like, right? I'm not given to giving money to political candidates. I would give money to charitable causes that I like, but not to people. So even now, when I'm not under those strictures, I don't do that. I don't donate to candidates. I don't put bumper stickers on my car. You're not going to find a sign outside of my house. That's just the guy I am, right? But with Hussman, his value statement, the way that he interprets it, he says, I wonder if Nikole Hannah-Jones agrees with these values. Her career would indicate to me that she doesn't agree with these values. And when you ask him why, and I had the opportunity to do that in an interview, he says some things that are a little strange for journalism. I mean, it's a continuing conversation in journalism, but for instance, Walter Hussman doesn't think that people who are newspaper reporters should write books. He thinks that is compromising your objectivity, that you're going to, if you turn your daily newspaper reporting into a larger book, that you're eventually going to make commentary, or you're going to turn it into a narrative, and that's going to queer the whole thing. And it's not a good practice. Well, who disagrees with that is Bob Woodward. Who disagrees with that is David Marinus of the Washington Post, who's written books about Bill Clinton in his backyard, in Walter Hussman's backyard in Arkansas, that are terrific, especially if you hate Bill Clinton. James B. Stewart of the Wall Street Journal, who wrote the wonderful Clinton Whitewater book, Bloodsport, which everybody should read, especially if you hate the Clintons. There's a lot of fresh meat in there for you. And so that's just a narrow definition that he has that I think is partially to do with his own experience in newspaper journalism, right? He's not a long form journalism guy. He doesn't write for magazines. He doesn't do any real journalistic writing anymore, but he's not a guy who has written a book. He's not a guy who's done those things. And so his conception comes from his roots in his family's newspaper business. He thinks this is how it should be, which is fine. You can think that. Can you enforce that on other people? Can you make that a litmus test for hires at the UNC Hussman School, for instance? If you don't like what Nikole Hannah-Jones has done, are you within your rights to lobby against her, as he did with multiple people privately, while saying at the same time, I'm a journalist. I have to stand outside of public controversy. I can't possibly make a public comment about the Nikole Hannah-Jones thing, and then privately email people to try to, affect the outcome. That is where the controversy lies. That's where there's an argument even within journalism about.
So he's a donor, the largest donor to that school. Mm-hmm. He's got core values, and it seems like there's a miscommunication there when he says, I want these values etched in stone and stuck on your foyer when you walk in, saying this is a husband school. He thought that meant the school was adopting it. They thought, no, we're just describing what Hussman's values are, but they're not necessarily our values.
Well, yeah, because if you walk into this, have you ever been to Carroll Hall at UNCG?
Yeah. Well, back when I was in the business school.
Have you been recently? Have you been recently?
Yeah.
So this is fascinating. And I'm writing a book right now, and this is a scene in the book. When you walk into Carroll Hall at UNC, which I did for the first time last year, right? Because I didn't go to UNC. So when you walk in, you will see Walter Hussman's values on the right side. Now, right now, it's not etched in stone because for a variety of reasons they haven't been able to do that yet. It's sort of like this. It's a fresco essentially of his values, and then over here on your left, you will see the Pulitzer Prize that was awarded to, I believe it's the Tabor City Times. I could have that wrong, but I think that's right. Small town newspaper in North Carolina for its crusade against the KKK, right? So on one side, you have Walter Hussman saying journalism is not about crusades. We don't take sides, especially on contentious political issues, like, for instance, the KKK and segregation in the 50s and 60s. And then on the other side, you see the Pulitzer that was awarded to these people for their newspaper crusade against one side of a contentious political issue in the South in its time, right? So it is, depending upon how you look at it, is either cognitive dissonance or that's just America, man. Like, you got these people who believe these things and you got these people who believe these things, and there's room for all of it. And I think the faculty there kind of believe both things. First of all, the faculty's not all on one page. Like, some of them are very strongly in favor of not only Hussman's statement, but his interpretation of it. And others say, well, journalism has its own set of values, and we need to have a conversation about what objectivity means, because a lot of, over the course of many decades in American journalism, objectivity meant the view from nowhere. Like, it meant, right, we're trying to stay outside of these things. Well, if you're outside of things while injustices are happening, that's something of a problem. And so Nikole Hannah-Jones, she's had a fascinating career because, like me, she came from a background where there weren't professional writers, where there weren't professional journalists. There was not a road that was paved for her. And she went to Notre Dame. She went to UNC for grad school. She became very successful and inspired by her time at UNC, and she still has a great affection for the school.
When she was, she received a full scholarship for that, right? So she was.
I wouldn't swear to that, but I know that she has been. I mean, she is academically well suited, and so it wouldn't surprise me to hear that. But she, while there, became who she is. She began to flower like many of us do in higher education environments where we are wanted and feel supported. And she worked her way up from, I believe, somebody told me the other day she worked for the High Point Enterprise for a little while.
Really?
I haven't been able to confirm that, but somebody who I think would know said that. But she also worked for the Chapel Hill News, very small organization, right? Then she worked for the News and Observer, and she kept working her way up until she was at the New York Times, and now she's a New York Times bestselling author, and and all of this. So over the course of her career, she had a lot of experiences that Walter Hussman didn't have. And I don't just mean that she was a woman in journalism, and I don't just mean that she was a black woman in journalism. I mean that she practiced other types of journalism. She wrote a lot of daily newspaper stories like I did, like Walter Hussman did when he was younger. She also wrote long-form magazine pieces. She wrote political analysis. She wrote opinion pieces. People tend to forget that the Pulitzer that she won is for an opinion piece, right? She wrote investigative pieces. She did a lot of different types of things, all of which are under the umbrella of journalism. Walter Hussman's idea about journalism is it should be basically what I do in my daily newspapers. And his problem with Nikole Hannah-Jones is a couple-fold. One, he has problems, as do a lot of people, with the 1619 Project, and he thinks that there are historical inaccuracies, as do some historians. And he also took issue with an essay that she wrote about reparations to Black people in America. And these are the things that we know that he objected to because we have his emails. What he said in private phone conversations, who can say? But those are the things that are on record. And so I think it's basically this fascinating story, which is one of the reasons why I began writing about it. It's this fascinating story about two people who are generations apart, who are different genders, who are different races, who are both journalists, and who have differing ideas about journalism, which is itself, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, undergoing something of an evolution, not only in the delivery methods, not only in how we pay for it, not only in how it's presented to us, but also in what journalism is. You know, I've never been the kind of guy who says John Hammer over at the Rhino Times, that's not journalism. Carolina Journal over, you know, John Locke Society's thing, that's not journalism. Policy Watch is journalism. The New York Times is journalism. Fox News, that's not journalism, right? I think it's all journalism. It's all journalism. And discerning adults can tell the difference between the Carolina Journal and Policy Watch, between the New York Times and the Daily Caller, between the Daily Wire and the, you know, the Daily Mail. You know, like discerning adults can tell the difference. And the important thing is media literacy. And also another thing that I think has been a common theme of this conversation, which is like making up your own mind.
Sure. So it's interesting, you know, the Daily Tar Heel just published a survey, a DEI survey.
I saw that.
I think today, where they were going through and showing that their reporting staff was, I think, significantly more Caucasian than UNC as a whole.
Yep.
And good for them for publishing that and acknowledging kind of where they are. Now, I don't believe in quotas, and I don't believe you should say we need to have X number of people of this background and X number of people this other. You have to allow for people to have free will, and there's going to be all kinds of factors come into play. And I don't think you can say, okay, we're reserving X number of seats on the plane for this demographic and this demographic. I mean, it just doesn't. Quotas to me don't make any sense. I think they are oversimplification and in fact lead to discrimination. But did you ever and you've researched this a ton, did you ever get the read that anything that Hussman was objecting to or that people in the school were in the university were doing or in the Hussman school were doing were related to race? That any of this was? I
think it was related to race, but it's not explicitly about racism. So people forget this part of it too. What they were trying to hire Nikole Hannah-Jones for was a Knight chair. And the Knight Foundation, for people who don't know, is not just a thing from Knight Rider in the 80s. It's also, the Knight Foundation is also a journalism organization that endows these chairs at universities for specific purposes, right? And so at UNC, there are endowed chairs. The Knight Foundation is part of that process. And
that pays for a portion of the salary, but not the full salary.
Right. And so the Knight chair that they were trying to hire, for which they were trying to hire Nikole Hannah-Jones, was a Knight chair in race and journalism, right? Now, her journalism, partially because she's a Black woman and she has the experiences and life experience that she has, and also because this is her area of interest.
Yep. Backing up for a second. Yeah. Before that, there were two other Knight chairs before that through the journalism school.
I think there might have been as many as 3, but there were certainly 2. Yes.
But those weren't race and investigative journalism before.
Right. Yeah.
This was kind of coming off the heels of BLM movement, and there were some criticisms of the journalism school at that time for not being diverse enough as well.
I think there have been criticisms of the journalism school for decades in that area. But you're right that Knight chairs. So one of the things that the Knight Foundation does is they look at schools and they look at programs and they say, what is it that you guys want to accomplish with this, with this chair? And for this particular instance, they wanted a Knight chair in race and journalism, right? And so so they pursued Nikole Hannah-Jones. She was courted. They brought her in to teach, classes as sort of a tryout, and they did all the things you do when you're trying to hire a tenured chair. And when
they brought her in for classes, like a guest lecturer, to come in,
right?
But she hadn't taught before in other.
She'd done like guest lecturing. She'd never been a full-time teacher. No.
Yeah. Like I've done guest lecturing.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's the purpose of a Knight chair. Actually, the Knight chair and the Knight chairs in journalism are people who are not teachers. So for instance, you ever read Michael Pollan's great book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, or any of those? So Michael Pollan is a sort of a pop science writer who writes a lot about food. He wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. He just did this great book about caffeine, which as a caffeine fiend myself, I really appreciated. He's a Knight chair, right? But he's not primarily a teacher or trained to be a teacher. They're trying to bring people from the profession into classrooms for the purposes of teaching, so that the students are getting the experience of learning from someone whose training is actually doing this thing at a very high level. So that was the idea with this Knight chair, and that wasn't not the case with other Knight chairs. All the Knight chairs are not primarily teachers. They're people from the profession. So when they bring Nikole Hannah-Jones and you asked, is it related to race? I think it's related to race in that they were looking for somebody who could speak to reporting on racial issues. It's not related to race in that they were like, we need to find a black person, right? We need to find a black woman. We need to find a prominent black woman. And also,
I remember reading a memo from Susan King that did basically say that they needed to increase their diversity within the school, and they were going to use some waivers that allowed them to hire without having to kind of consider all candidates, but to select one or another. And there's actually like up to $100,000 a year that you can get to support hiring from more diverse backgrounds.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the case at a lot of schools, not just, schools at UNC, like schools at the university, but also schools within different universities at the UNC system level. But so let's pause here for a moment and say, here's why I think that's actually important. I worked at the News and Record for 10 years, right? And over the course of that time, the staff was overwhelmingly white. It was overwhelmingly middle to upper middle class. It was overwhelmingly, professional class. It was overwhelmingly Christian. And the newspaper coverage really reflected that. The example that I always give that's sort of funny is I remember being in my mid-20s at the News and Record and going to news meetings. And I would say every other news meeting, there would be this longish discussion of, are we going to get a new grocery store? Are we going to get a Trader Joe's? Is it coming to Greensboro? Right. And as a guy who was like 25, 26 years old, I could give a shit if we get a Trader Joe's, right? I still couldn't care. And I'm almost
clearly you haven't shopped for enough frozen food at Trader Joe's, right? Then you would care.
I've been to Trader Joe's now and I think it's fine, but I'm almost 40 and I still don't care if we get a Trader Joe's, right? But also, I don't think that's the most important issue that the daily newspaper should be dealing with, right? And it was taking up an enormous amount of time and effort. They were writing multiple stories about the rumor that a Trader Joe's might come, right? And I began thinking, why is this happening? And then I realized, because the people who are making decisions about news coverage are people who are middle-class white people or middle or upper middle-class white people who are very interested in shopping at Trader Joe's. They don't like that they have to go all the way to Chapel Hill to do it.
But what are the demographics of the reader? So when you were working at the News and Record, who were your readers?
Well, I think at that time they were overwhelmingly white and older. Yeah. And I think
presumably they had more disposable income if they're signing up for a subscription, which is not, what
possibly.
we see sometimes when we see people I've had discussions with Goldie Wells and Sharon Hightower both about why retailers choose certain areas. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with demographics, because you can go to Atlanta, or nothing to do with race, because you can go to Atlanta and you see plenty of stores in various areas, or other minority majority cities with significant wealth. But what they do look at is disposable income. And so if they go into an area and someone's making, let's say, $25,000, and, that's barely enough then to pay for the base needs, they're not able to shop at a Trader Joe's maybe. And so, a lot of times these higher income, the Starbucks of the world and other places, are going where they've got people with higher income because they can afford their services.
Right.
For more of these luxury items that, aren't in, you don't have, I have to have coffee every day. Whether or not I have to have Starbucks coffee, I don't have to have it. I would drink, if I were stuck with no other choice, I would drink whatever sort of coffee. I wouldn't care what it tastes like, just for my caffeine fix.
But my thought back then was, and it still is today, maybe that discussion about, are we going to get a Trader Joe's? Maybe those multiple stories about, are we going to get a Trader Joe's? Maybe that's a better story for the Business Journal. Like, is that really what we need to be devoting resources to when we only have so many resources? Couldn't we be doing, as we talked about earlier, investigative pieces into government, or corruption in, the following thing, or environmental reporting, or court reporting, or any number of things? We really need to write another story about Trader Joe's. And I think it just reflected the concerns of the people who are making the decisions. And I saw that again and again and again. In not only at the News and Record. I don't pick on the News and Record too much. I worked at the Cape Cod Times. I worked at the Bristol Press. I've written for other papers. I found it again and again and again. Your coverage will look like the people who are in your newsroom, not only at the top, but also in the middle and at the bottom. So if you don't happen to have any black reporters, you're missing an important voice in your community, particularly if you have a significant number of black people who are just going to see things you're not going to see. You know what I mean? Like, they're just going to see the world in a different way. And I think that's important. And it's also true of having, gay people, having Republicans, having Democrats, having,
I think that's a great point, Joe. I think the viewpoint diversity out there is critical. And that may be socioeconomic, that may be racial, that may be gender, where you're providing different views. And you almost need like advisory board of sorts to look at some of these papers. And
when newspapers were healthier, they had ombudsmen.
Yeah.
And that's becoming, increasingly rare, but they used to have these positions for people who don't know called ombudsman. And it would be a position that essentially is the advocate for the community with the newspaper. If the community has some sort of problem with the newspaper, they go to the ombudsman and say, I got this problem. And then the ombudsman can go to them, or they can write something and say, here's how we're dealing with this issue with the newspaper. As newspapers have shrunk, of course, that's one of many things that's sort of gone away.
So at NC Policy Watch, what are the demographics like there?
So we have a pretty small staff because we're a nonprofit and we're a pretty small newsroom, but there's me, right? There's Lynn Bonner, former reporter for the News and Observer. She's black. There's Greg Childress, who's a former reporter for the Durham Herald Sun. He's black. There's Lisa Sorg, who is white. So it's like 2 black people, 2 white people. Rob Schofield is white. We occasionally have like contributors from the community who write columns and things like that, but they're not on staff.
And what are the different beats? So what is the NC Policy Watch cover?
So I don't have a beat. I'm sort of I'm an investigative reporter. Is more senior investigative reporter is my technical title, and so I could conceivably write about anything. But in practical terms, I write about a couple of coverage areas in which I'm most interested, and the UNC system became one of those for a couple of reasons. One is that it is. I think people in North Carolina do not realize the reach and the scope and the size of the UNC system. It is all over the state, from the mountains to the coast. It affects an enormous number of people's lives, be they students or faculty or staff or people who benefit from having those things in their community. So that became sort of an interest area of mine. So, but I don't have a beat. I'm an investigative reporter. I could conceivably write about anything. Lynn Bonner is the same way. She's an investigative reporter, sort of, without portfolio. She can write about just about anything. She has interest areas. Health is an interest area of hers, particularly. She won awards at the News and Observer for her coverage of Black maternal health. Greg Childress covers K through 12 reporting. Lisa Sorg is an environmental reporter. Up until a little while ago, we had a reporter who covered just courts. Melissa Boughton, who won awards doing that and was incredible, but unfortunately got out of the journalism business. And we're hiring right now. So we're hopeful to bring in another person to cover that area. So courts, K through 12, environment, and then investigative stuff. Not that we're not all doing investigative stuff, but those are sort of beat areas that we cover. Sure. Yeah.
So, when you're writing about these different things, you're looking for, how much are you celebrating, let's say, success? So,
yeah.
I mean, because I know you write about the Boy Scouts, leading a fundraiser that, solves something, it's not the dirty laundry that a lot of people want to read. How much is there, dirty laundry versus positive stories out there just in the media overall?
In all journalism,
the Don Henley dirty laundry song.
Yes. In all journalism, there is a bias toward conflict. There is a bias toward, as you say, dirty laundry. There's a bias toward
bleeds it leads.
Yes, exactly. I was a cops and courts reporter for years. I can tell you we gave a lot more column inches to somebody got shot than somebody got saved. That is, that has always been the case. And it is a problem, I think, in journalism in general. I will say that, I have been recently concentrating on metrics. I've been looking at what our audience reads, what our audience shares online. And I am happy to tell you that last week I wrote a story about the Board of Governors raising the cap on out-of-state admissions for HBCUs, which I think the Board of Governors would tell you is a positive move and a positive story. And it got an enormous amount of audience attention. It got an enormous amount of shares on Facebook, on Twitter. It got an enormous amount of number of unique reads. And people were really talking about it. So I think that's evidence that you can write about stuff that's, quote unquote positive. Everybody's complaint about journalism is there's not enough positive stuff. You can write about stuff that people think is positive. And I think most people would agree that in the case of HBCUs in North Carolina, anyway, in the UNC system, raising that cap is a positive thing because I think all of them can demonstrate that they are already accepting the number of qualified in-state students that they can, and so nobody's going to be excluded by also letting other people come to our very fine HBCUs.
And generally in the past, I have always said, the university exists to provide the benefits of the university to the people of the state. Mm-hmm. And I'm very focused on making sure that every North Carolinian that wants to go to one of our schools has that opportunity out there. Now, I did vote for the last increase in the HBCU enrollment because they presented a different set of data. And what they said was, look, our students used to just come to these schools. Now they're going to Carolina and they're going to state and going to other schools. And we're running out of the most qualified people to attend our schools. And so it's not that they don't have a place. They have a place. They're just choosing, let's say, between A&T and state. Some may choose A&T, some may choose state, but there's less applicants overall. And so in order to keep the standards up, they need to allow applicants from other states to apply.
Well, and except for Central, which saw a modest decrease in the number of students who are attending between 2019 and now. Every HBCU in North Carolina has seen every HBCU in the North Carolina system, in the UNC system, has seen an increase in people who are attending, in actual students. And some of those are dramatic, like A&T right here in Greensboro.
And Elizabeth City State, too.
Yeah, and Elizabeth City State, which has come up from a low.
Because of NC Promise.
That's right. Well. NC Promise has been a huge deal, especially for HBCUs. And as somebody
I remember James Anderson at Fayetteville State Chancellor Anderson complaining about that, saying, I remember distinctly, he said, who would want to buy a $500 car? And I said, well, Chancellor Anderson, it's not buying a $500 car. It's buying a $10,000 car for $500. Who wouldn't want to buy it for that?
Right. And it's interesting because I think
Daryl Allison has come back around on that. Now Faithful State is part of NC Promise.
Right. Yes. Daryl Allison. Yes. And so I think that for me, people sometimes ask me, is there anything positive that you would say about the UNC Board of Governors, for instance, because you read all these stories that make them look so bad. And one of the things that I would say is I was a first generation college student, right? And I was broke. And going to UNCG was at the outside of my ability to pay for it, right? And I took out loans and I worked jobs and I was an RA and I did everything I could to be able to afford to do that. And I was still just scraping by. My parents were not in a position to pay for all of that for me. And I think that NC Promise program would have been enormous for me and kids like me when I was in college. And I'm really glad that, from a North Carolina citizen level, that we have something like that in place, because I think more people deserve to go to college, and people who want to go to college, and people who want to go to college and can't afford it ought to have an option. And some of these schools are excellent schools. I think that there was an initial worry that they would be seen as cut rate schools or discount schools if they did this.
There was part of that, and then there was a group of people trying to say that the legislature was not going to continue to fund it, that it was going to be a one and done type deal, and they were going to lower the rate and then raise it back in an effort to somehow damage the schools, which, you have to remember who was pushing that at the time. And it was Tom Apodaca. And I remember I was standing outside his office, and some alumni from various schools came out, and he said, they don't want to be part of it. Fine. And he was supporting this for Western.
Right.
And, and he loves Western. So anyone that would have thought that he would be damaging his own favored school with this program, everybody else was getting the same benefit. And if they didn't want it, which a lot of groups and chancellors did not, those schools that got it have done exceptionally well.
Well, and that's what in your business you call a proof of concept, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
when you see a thing work, other people will want to be part of it, I think. The way that we got to talking about this, though, was talking about Nikole Hannah-Jones at UNC Chapel Hill. And I think that what's really interesting to me about that case, in addition to it just being it having everything, right? I mean, one of the reasons that story just lit up and went crazy is that it has everything. It has race, it has politics, it has journalism, it has academia.
But how much did race really factor in? A lot of people keep saying that, like the board was racist. And I can tell you, one of our last board meetings when this topic was discussed, I said, if anybody discriminated against someone and there was some racial discrimination going on, root them out, fire them, get rid of them, call them out. They don't need to be part of the university system. But I have not been able to find any evidence of it being racial, other than someone saying, well, the 1619 project is about race, and so therefore it is. But again, I've heard conversations about the research involved or the conclusions reached, but she was offered a job.
Yes.
And she accepted the job on a tenure track. And this was a decision by Susan King. The board never voted no.
And the chancellor
never voted no. I think Susan King saw an expedient way to get to the same place and made that offer. And frankly, but for your article, maybe she wouldn't have kind of saw it as much of a slight. From my standpoint, where I come down on tenure. I don't believe in tenure.
Right.
I don't believe in lifetime appointments for
You've been
anyone.
very consistent in that, yes.
Because, I just don't, the rest of us don't have that in the world. And I have not heard a good enough argument.
The Pope has it,
Well, and I don't think the Pope should have it either. Yeah. I don't think federal judges should have it either.
Right.
I don't believe any of them should have it.
Right.
But it's, so that was really the only perceived slight was the tenure decision.
Well, it depends.
But she was offered the same. I mean, her salary wasn't any different. She was tenure track, and tenure track really results in tenure. I mean,
well, see, here's the crux of the argument, the jugular of the whole thing, right? Is it depends who you ask, because what you're saying is there was an expedient way of hiring her, and so they did that. Now, Dean Susan King did. Yes,
that wasn't right. The Board of Trustees didn't say, "Well, we're not going to grant tenure, and so therefore you should do this instead."
Well, it's interesting.
She made that decision, I believe.
Yeah. Well, but
again, I wasn't part of the Board of Trustees. So.
Yeah, right. Susan King's story and Nikole Hannah-Jones' story and the Chancellor's story is that came about because, and we've seen this happen in other ways, so it's not like shocking to me that this would happen. That tenure decision went into a committee, went into the university governance. No, I'm sorry, not university governance. That's Board of Governors. On the Board of Trustees, Duckett's committee. Help me out here.
Typically it's like personnel and tenure.
Yeah. It goes into this committee and it doesn't come out. And now some of this is who are you going to believe? Because there's not any way to empirically prove it. That there were some back channel communications between Bob Bluen, the then provost of UNC, the chancellor of UNC, Kevin Guskowitz, and Susan King and Nikole Hannah-Jones, wherein it was communicated to them, you need to find a different way to do this. We don't want to have a vote on this because not everybody's going to agree, and it's going to get ugly and it's going to get political. And in the end, we don't necessarily think you're going to win it. So if you want to hire her, you got to figure out a way to do it without this automatic tenure thing. Now, could that be because people felt like you do, that tenure is not an automatic thing, or should even be a thing? Could it be because people think a politically controversial person like Nikole Hannah-Jones, and she is undeniably politically controversial, as is her work, is not something that we want associated with the school, or we want to put a person in a tenure position where then they can basically, carry out this work and we have no ability to sever our relationship with them, or it's harder to do so.
But I think isn't it probably like 1 in 100 people that are hired that don't have tenure already that are granted tenure on day one? I mean,
the difference being
most of the tenure stuff that I've seen come up is someone's already working for the university in their tenure track, and then they're conferred tenure. Yeah. Or they're brought in and they have tenure somewhere else, and so therefore they're granted tenure here. But I don't remember seeing a lot of, and I would think that it probably occurs most, I would guess, in the journalism school and the business school, or someplace where you're hiring more from the professional side.
Yes, the factor,
bringing them in.
The biggest factor here was that Knight Foundation thing, which I think a lot of people like. So this is another thing that I'm proud of in a way that I don't think is egotistical. If you read only my coverage of this, you would have gotten all of the correct facts about what happened. You would have gotten all of the correct steps. You would have understood what the tenure thing is. You would have understood what a Knight Foundation chair is. You would have understood how many there had been. You would have understood all of that. But when the national media got involved, when the New York Times and the Washington Post and Time Magazine and CNN and all these people began reporting it, a lot of those little details
nuances
got
went
lost.
Away.
Yeah. And so it became the Board of Governors rejected tenure. That didn't happen. There wasn't a vote. It became that it was a tenure track position. It wasn't a tenure track position. It was a tenured position. People didn't understand how rare it is in academia for there to be these positions that come with tenure. Now, it's not necessarily like you say. If there's a position that's set up to come from the professions, or a special situation, a named chair, an endowed thing, then very often, or in this case, always, it will come with tenure. And that means that the Board of Trustees at that time needs to approve it. And that's always the case, right? But the difference is, and I think this is an interesting look at how the boards of trustees and the board of governors has changed under Republican leadership over the course of the last decade plus, which is that Republicans came in, and when they took over state government and they had enough of a majority that they could begin appointing all of the members of the board of governors, and then they took away the power of the governor to appoint members of the boards of trustees, conveniently right when they elected a Democrat. That wasn't something they were interested in doing when McCrory was governor, only after he lost. Once they, which by the way, like, good politics, you know what I mean? Like, as somebody who's standing outside of that and watching it, that's a very shrewd move. But anyway, when they do that, they begin to question a lot of things about how academia has worked in general. Somebody like you who doesn't believe that tenure should be a thing, right? That's a minority position, as you know, because you are, on the losing end of that vote frequently.
Well, even on my board.
Yeah, even on your board. That's exactly right.
Which is, by the way, chaired by a Democrat, and the secretary is a Democrat, and you've got Gene Davis, who was a big Democrat. Teresa, big Democrat.
It's a lot more diverse than the Board of Governors, for sure. Yeah. But that is an opinion. These questions about, like, well, it's always worked this way in academia, but should it? Right? A lot of those questions begin to be asked by Republicans and conservative Republicans who look at academia and see a lot of things that they don't like, right? That was less the case when Democrats were in charge. So all of a sudden, it's like, well, but that always has tenure. It becomes not so fast. We've still got to approve it. And if we don't agree with it, then it doesn't automatically go through. We're not a rubber stamp, right? And so you can feel one of two ways about that. You can feel like, well, this is the new boss and he's got some questions and you got to answer them. Or you can feel these people are inserting themselves into things that are not their business, right?
Yeah. And I mean, when people ask me, so what changed when Republicans got involved? And I wouldn't even say Republicans because, I served on the Board of Governors for 8 years and I argued with Republicans on a lot of issues. So it's not an R versus D discussion. I mean, hell, on Board of Governors, we were talking about chancellor raises one time. We were nearly at a split vote. So you had half and half on the same issue. I think what our class of appointees were more independent thinkers. And we actually read the materials. It's real easy with these things. And it's the biggest problem I believe there is with government and nonprofit boards and, really any sort of boards, especially the university boards, where you're offered a lot of free, very nice stuff, right? So if I want tickets to every game, I can have tickets to every game. Now, I don't think that's right. So what I've told them, and there's, I've got written correspondence about this where I've said, look, if I'm going to take a ticket, I'm going to pay for it. And, I want to keep a running track and I'll pay, I'm not going to pay like every game, but keep a running track and I'll pay, but I'm committing to pay on everything. And I also feel like sometimes I don't take some of those benefits because I'm concerned that it's the appearance of a conflict as well. And, if we're voting on the athletic director's salary or we're voting on a coach's salary, and at the same time we're attending a game, cheering on, wanting somebody to win, or we're getting tickets to a game or getting preferred parking or VIP treatment, then it's a little tough. Or if you're attending a musical performance or a cocktail party or anything else, the Board of Trustees and Board of Governors historically have been wined and dined to a significant degree. And then you've got a lot of people like Roger Perry who have built entire careers around doing transactions in Chapel Hill where the university is a tenant or they've developed something beside it. And so you've got this whole, and most recently with Harry Smith.
Yes, indeed.
With his transaction with A&T where he made $8.5 million.
Go read that WRAL story.
So, there's a lot of these people on there in the past that have received a benefit in terms of tickets or treatment or ability to reach out to a chancellor about maybe someone applying to a school or something like that, that is a perceived benefit. There's also the prestige of it. Mm-hmm. And then there's the potentially financial gain if you are negotiating for your company to do business with the university. And there's been a cleaning of house on that, generally speaking, where less people are being appointed with that sort of a benefit, or that would take that sort of a benefit. And I think that's been the big change. And the people that had that benefit, that had all those tickets or had those deals, don't like it, and they want to be back on there. And so any way they can to stand on the sidelines and critique and try and get those seats back, they want those seats back.
Well, you'd be in a better position to talk about that than I would, because you were inside of it. But I think that the differences go well beyond that, in the sense that, so I'll give you some examples of what I think, my personal opinion, what I think is good and what I think is bad. So I do think that you see a larger number of people now on the board of governors, and also some of these boards of trustees, who come from backgrounds more like Randy Ramsey, or more like, who's the gentleman from Western North Carolina, the colorful former sheriff?
Phil Byers.
Phil Byers, yeah.
Boy, he is hilarious.
Yes, indeed. So you see more people like that on the board than you would have previously. And that's maybe a good thing, because they're.
And on those two people, what I think is, it's a diverse background, diverse viewpoints, but they care very deeply for the university. Randy has been very generous with NC State and trying to attract people to be able to pursue their dreams and give them the opportunity that he didn't have.
Right.
And Phil Byers the same way. He has been so generous and raised a lot of money through different sources for different programs. And it's changed lives in that part of the state. And I think, those two are characteristic of big-hearted, nice people, that care about the university. And you don't have to be the snobbish wine and cheese crowd that frankly may be more selfish and not care about the university, more caring about what they get out of it than what they're giving back. And so I think it's been refreshing to see people like Phil Byers or Randy Ramsey or me on the board that, when Phil Berger Senator Berger reached out to me about serving, I didn't know nearly what I know now about the UNC system. And, but I think he felt like some fresh perspective where he was appointing people more for their new way of looking at things and bringing, I think you just need to bring a fresh perspective periodically, especially to a big institution that sometimes is self-dealing and self-serving, and bringing outsiders in that can break through that. And not that everybody that comes in will be perfect, but it's a change of the regime.
That's a big positive for sure, at least in my opinion, because, Randy Ramsey and I are from similar backgrounds. We're from similar geographic areas. I remember talking about Republicans being at each other's throats. I remember when Randy Ramsey became the head of the BOG, I had several, not one, but I think 3 BOG members who were Republicans call me up or email me and say, Randy doesn't even have a 4-year degree. Randy went.
Yeah, they shopped that story all over the state.
Yeah,
led by, I'm going to presume, in my opinion, it would be Harry Smith.
So the number of people contacted me and said, don't you want to write this story about how he doesn't even have a 4-year degree? He went to a community college. And I don't remember if he went to Carteret Community College or went to Craven Community College, but it's down in that area. And they were like, don't you think that's a big story? And I had to tell them, that's where I'm from. But for, a few small things, that's where I would have gone to college. Why do you think I think that's shameful? Why do you think that I think that is, beneath someone who should be on the board of governors, who should be the head of the board of governors? I think that it's admirable that somebody who comes from a modest background, went to a community college, has risen to the level where they're now making decisions at the UNC system level and are looked to by the other board of governors members as a leader. Why would that be a bad thing? And people were like, what are you talking about? And I think because of the way I speak, because of I don't have a strong accent, because of I don't know, the way I dress or something because I work for a newspaper. People
just assume you're liberal, so you're a snob.
They think I'm liberal. They think I'm a Yankee. They think I'm, that I went to Duke or UNC or Johns Hopkins or something. And they just don't understand that I'm Eastern North Carolina trailer trash. Like I come from a very modest background, and, the people in my family were commercial fishermen. My grandfather, who I told you about, and my uncle, they died at sea as commercial fishermen, like not that long ago. So the idea that I would in some way have affinity with them and look down on Randy Ramsey is just silly.
When you look at what the board has done, going back to accomplishments, one of the things I'm probably most proud of that the board has done is the widespread articulation agreement with community colleges that allows credits to transfer over in a path from community college to the universities without losing credits in there, and letting people know when they're going through this, okay, this one's going to count, this one's not. And here's how it tracks over to this course on the university side. And also a reverse articulation agreement where you take someone that had 2 years worth of schooling at a university, but then had to stop out, and they would qualify for an associate's degree.
Yes.
And so, that's what happens when you don't have a bunch of snobs on the board of governors. We're actually looking back and saying, hey, let's figure out what's in the best interest of the people of the state, not let's, have this ivory tower, this elite place that, oh, you peon, don't you dare come, begging at the door. We're keeping everyone out that doesn't fit our preferred profile.
I think there's a bit of that for sure. And I agree with you about the community college thing. And I have friends and family who have benefited from that kind of thing, and not only just in this state, but in other states. And I think that that's great. And I think it should have happened earlier. I will say, so on the negative side, the UNC Board of Governors is stacked with political appointees and pretty much purged Democrats for years. The only Democrat on the board right now is Joel Ford, who's a Democrat who lost his Democratic seat in a primary because he was voting so often with Republicans and talking about maybe he'd join the Republican Party, right? That's the sort of Democrat who is welcome on the Board of Governors right now. I don't think it's a positive to have that sort of litmus test for any political board of political appointees. But on the Board of Trustees,
you've got 5 Democrats.
On the UNC Chapel Hill Board of Trustees.
Yes, on the UNC Chapel Hill Board of Trustees.
Right. And I think that the boards of trustees in general are going to be a little more diverse for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is because it's hard to find a group of fellow travelers in every geographic area, particularly at HBCUs. But I think that the downside is you got some scoundrels. You got some, like that Board of Governors has been over the course of just the years that the Republicans have been in charge, as you say, has been full of some people who had their nose in the trough for their own businesses. It's been full.
And I would say, for the most part, we called them out and held them accountable.
Eventually, after a couple of years, yeah.
You don't find out right away. Yeah. You're an investigative reporter. You don't find out right away. Well, how do you know how long it takes to get a Freedom of Information Act request back?
Oh, very long time.
When I ask for info, it's the same thing. It might take a year.
Right. And I will say that as an investigative reporter, just stuff that I've written about on the Board of Governors, the Board of Governors essentially ignored, I think wouldn't happen on a board that didn't have as much like political hegemony, like that they weren't, like quite that homogenous, when you look around a Board of Governors and you see current active lobbyists who are lobbying the very General Assembly that they are also appointed by, that's a bit of a problem. When you see people who are former heads of the North Carolina Republican Party or people who were 6 months ago in the General Assembly, that might be a if it's not a real problem, it's at least a perception problem.
I do think there needs to be, and I've said this before,
a cooling off period. You've said that. A
cooling off period.
Yeah.
And I think that that's appropriate out there. So you mentioned a book, and you said, book about UNC.
Yeah.
So when can we expect to see that? And,
wouldn't I love to tell you? So over the course of the last few years at NC Policy Watch, I've been writing a lot about the UNC system. And I think there's a lot of, as this conversation has shown, there's a lot of interesting nuances and nooks and crannies to explore about public education, public higher education, what it should be, how politics is involved in that inevitably because it's a state institution. And so particularly in the last few years when there's been more conflict, people have said to me over and over again, like, well, you should write a book. You should write a book. If you're a daily newspaper reporter and your experience is, writing 100, 200, 300 stories a year for most of your career, the idea of taking the time and the effort to write a book seems a little silly. But something that happened to me over the course of the last few years is I kept meeting reporters who I respect, who are, reporters from this state who have written books. That excellent book by both Nick Oshner and I'm so embarrassed that I'm forgetting the other gentleman who works for Axios, who wrote The Vote Collectors. I thought that was a really terrific book. It has something for everybody. Republicans are going to read it and go, ha, see, I told you. Democrats are going to go, ha, see, I told you. It really killer book. There's a guy who was a student at UNC Chapel Hill and then worked at the Tar Heel and then worked at the Chronicle of Higher Education. He wrote a book called Discredited about that athletic scandal that he started covering when he was a student at the Tar Heel, right? And he continued at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and because that scandal went on for like 7 years, and so I interviewed him and talked to him a little bit, and with each of them I said, how did you do this? Like, how did you write a book, given what you have to do every day, given how news is always changing or whatever? And they said, well, it's both harder and easier than you might imagine, because you already have a terrific amount of knowledge about things that other people don't have from your having reported it so deeply. If you're a beat reporter or you're an investigative reporter, and it's harder also than you think it's going to be, because once you start looking at how much more additional reporting you're going to need to do, it's intimidating. So in terms of when one might read this book, my goal really is in the next year to have it finished. And, I've got some interest already from publishers. But there's there will be an amount of reporting where I'm just going to have to take some weeks off, and just devote myself to this.
I'm sure that won't make too many people happy.
Well, we'll see. I think certain people will be very happy. But it's interesting because it's like once when you're in journalism for a little while, your metabolism changes. Especially if you're in daily newspaper journalism, every day you're not publishing a story feels like you're doing something wrong. If you take a week, if you take 2 weeks, if you take a month on a story, you begin to feel like, what am I even doing here?
Well, and probably like a FOMO, something comes up and you're like, ooh, I want to write about that.
Exactly. And you have to sort of train yourself, as I've had to do after I got out of daily newspaper reporting, to say, okay, what if I write fewer stories, but they're deeper? What if I write fewer stories, but they're the things I really want to write about, not just whatever's happening today, and so that's hard. And also trying to write a book that I think is fair and is, I want it to include the stuff we've been talking about, like, how I think that there are some really bad things about the system that we have for politically appointing people to run this system. But it has also resulted in things that we've been talking about, which is because there was a political shift. There was also a shift in ideology in terms of, maybe who would be on the board and who would be leadership of the board and things like that. It doesn't mean there haven't been scandals. There have been. But I think that, the system the system and its leaders deserve credit for still being an outstanding public university system. I mean,
when you look at the metrics, I think we've got very enviable success over the last 10 years. Again, I wouldn't sit there and say it's a group effort, starting with the faculty and staff and the administration and the students, of course, and the graduate students, but then also the governing boards who have been willing to question things, because in order to adapt, and I wish that the one thing I look back on that I wish I'd been more forceful about was online education and hybrid education, which I pushed for when I came in 2013. And I feel like had we embraced that earlier, if we'd had a Project Kitty Hawk a few years ago and then COVID hit, boy, we would have been in great shape.
Absolutely. I remember those discussions about like when COVID hit, well, our whole model is based on people living on campus and living in dorms and all these things. Financially, things could fall apart if this gets, well, why should it be that way? The technology shouldn't make it so that it needs to be that way. But, to get back to you were saying like in the last 10 years, well, let me tell you this. I went to 3 years of high school, my last 3 years of high school in Bristol, Connecticut, right? And people in Bristol, Connecticut couldn't find most places in North Carolina on a map, right? And yet the reputation of the University of North Carolina, particularly Chapel Hill, was such that when I was looking at schools and I said to teachers of mine in Bristol, Connecticut, well, because I was born in North Carolina and because my dad's in the military and technically we're still residents of North Carolina, even though we are living elsewhere, I could get in-state tuition in North Carolina. And so I'm looking at North Carolina schools. Not one of them said, why would you look at North Carolina schools when you look at Connecticut schools? Why would you look at North Carolina schools when you go to UMass or SUNY? Every one of them said, oh my God, really? Because the North Carolina public education system for higher ed is amazing. You should go to Chapel Hill. It's a public Ivy. You should go to the following UNC school, NC State. You should go to, like they knew these schools. They had a reputation. One of them said to me, wherever Fred Chappell is, that's where you should go. It turns out Fred Chappell was at UNCG at the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, and UNCG has got a great reputation as well.
Yeah.
I think it's, I think for people from Greensboro over the years, it's been one of these things that because it's here,
right?
You're like, I don't want to go where where it's my hometown.
And for me, it was UNCG was so important because so I didn't have anybody who had gone to college in my family who I could talk to about this. Not a single person who I could say, how did you make this decision? How did you decide a school? How did you, for me, it was, oh my God, I can't afford any of this, right? My parents can't afford any of this. And also I don't know what I want. Like I have some vague idea of what I'm interested in studying, but I don't really know. So I took tours. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I went to, I decided to go to UMass Boston and I accepted and I got a college ID for UMass Boston, which I still have with my long flowing curly hair when I had it. And then I ended up going to UNCG. And one of the reasons was of the schools that I went to, it felt most like a place I'd feel welcome. When I went to UNC Chapel Hill, I'm ashamed to say now, because I think I just missed a lot of things back then. You know how you have these like tours that a student will lead? They'll lead a student tour, right, and they'll say, we went on one of those, my dad and I. And when we went, we got this young woman who was very excited about UNC Chapel Hill. And she was very excited to tell me how important Greek culture is there and how you'll want to join a fraternity or sorority right away. And it's such a key to the rest of the university and all these things. And I couldn't have been less interested in that. I was a punk rock kid, right? And so I was like, oh, this place doesn't seem like it's for me at all. And I missed so much of the rest of the university just because I made this snap decision.
You missed Cat's Cradle and all
I was
that,
18 years old and I heard this one thing I didn't like and I looked around a little bit and I just was like, I'm not sure. But when I went to UNCG, it felt much smaller than Chapel Hill, but still a large, gorgeous campus, larger and more gorgeous now than it's ever been. And it was a little artsy. It was a little bohemian as compared to some of the other places. Like it has that MFA program that's sort of famous, not only within the system, but nationally for writing. And I just thought, I could really see myself here, which I think is what you're looking for, whether you go to UNC Wilmington or you go to ECU or you go to App State or you go to, or you're at Chapel Hill or NC State or A&T. Like you're looking for that place that is a mixture of the things that you want academically, but also the college experience you want to have. Yeah. And North Carolina is really blessed in that it has so many universities that meet the needs of so many different types of people, first generation people, people of different income levels, people of different racial backgrounds and economic backgrounds, and cultural backgrounds. And I think that that's like, it's something that people who live in North Carolina and people don't necessarily recognize, like it's just here. So we just think we got great basketball teams, right? So, but we don't think about like the real diversity of the system and what a strength that is for people who want to go to college from the mountains to the coast.
So in your book, what are the primary themes? So what's the...
Well, I think that what I'm wrestling with in the book is, and the Nikole Hannah-Jones episode, I think, is an interesting example of this, is every conversation about public higher ed is a conversation about what people think higher ed should be, right? So like we've been talking about.
And that's the way it's been since its inception.
100%. And and North Carolina has an interesting, it's not unique in the nation or anything, but it has an interesting example of how Democrats were in charge of the university system for a very long time, or they were in charge of this part of the university system for a very long time. And the university system under Democrats reflected their values. It reflected what they were concerned about. It reflected what they valued, what they didn't. And then there was this shift to Republican leadership. And there were some major changes, some of them slow, some of them fast at the university level. And there was some panic about that because anytime things change, people panic. And I think some of that panic was warranted. And I think some of the moves that were made were like bald-facedly political and kind of crazy. And some of them were a long time coming and should have happened earlier, like we talked about with NC Promise and, more concentration on the community college system and all of that. So I think what the book is hopefully going to get at is, here we have this interesting laboratory of what happens in a university system when things go from this set of values to this set of values. And some things are universal. Across political ideologies, you have corruption. Across political ideologies, you have mistakes. Across political ideologies, you have things that make the university system great. Like I said, 20 plus years ago when I was in high school, the university system was great. People in Connecticut knew that, right? Now, people on the board of governors now would say, and we've made it even greater in the last 10 years, and other people would say they've ruined it. They've ruined the university system in the last 10 years. And like most things, the reality is somewhere in the middle.
And I would say, it's not just a change in values. It's a change of reading the materials and being engaged and weighing in. I think if you look back at historical board of governors and board of trustees votes, they were likely nearly all unanimous. And so there's just no diversity of thought on the board. And so, people keep portraying it like all the Republicans think the same way on the board of governors or the board of trustees. And we don't. We have various opinions, but we're unafraid to talk about it because we've read the materials. We're there to engage. We're talking about it. We're bringing different experiences in. And we're not just saying, well, we're going to rubber stamp everything that comes before us. So
one of the interesting things I think about conflict on the board of governors, at least over the course of the time that I've been there, is that you're correct that even when you have a group that is largely, if not entirely, Republicans, you can have conflict because the fact that somebody's a Republican doesn't necessarily mean they're on your same page. I mean, we're seeing that in the Republican Party right now at the national level, at the state level, right? Madison Cawthorn and Tim Moore are not on the same page on most things. Trump and Ben Shapiro, not on the same page on most things. Marty KOTIS and I'm trying to think of who I would say you're not on the same page with let's say Harry Smith when you were when he was on the board. Maybe you weren't always on the same page with those people. So I think it's an oversimplification to talk about partisanship and maybe more interesting to talk about ideology. But at the same time, I think that the type of person that you tend to get on a board of governors, and this was probably true when Democrats were in charge. I don't know because I didn't have a lot of experience covering it back then. You get alpha males. You get, like people who are accomplished business leaders, people who are thought leaders or party leaders or big donors. Well, you don't get to be a big donor unless you had some success in your life, right? Where did that come from? So you get these big outsized personalities. And whether it's Marty KOTIS, who's not afraid to be the only no vote on something and tell you why, or, stick a finger in the eye of the person who you think is doing the wrong thing and should be called out, or it's Harry Smith, who's a bull in a china shop, or it's, who's really interesting is Art Pope, because people think of, especially on the left, people think of Art Pope as this great boogeyman, who, is pulling strings and is whatever. And man, does Art Pope get blown off sometimes by fellow members of the Board of Governors. He'll say, I really think this is important and we should discuss it. And Jim Holmes or somebody else will be like, great. Yeah. Okay. Next thing. Well, I think
it's, a lot of times that's because someone like Art has spent a lot of time studying an issue, and it's very hard when you've got 24 members and you're going over a bunch of different items to have a substantive discussion in 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And so there's this pressure always for, people wanting to kind of, okay, let's get this over with. And my feeling, and Arts has a similar approach, is, look, if we're going to spend time and we're going to read 300 pages worth of materials, then we need to talk about it, not just get it in here, slap a rubber stamp on it and go.
A really interesting Art Pope thing recently for me was watching him say to the rest of the Board of Governors, okay, listen, why are we moving the UNC system offices to Raleigh? Like, did we as a board have a discussion about that? Or did we have a study? Have we looked at the pluses and minuses and the numbers? And are we like, what is the, we're going to ask people to uproot their lives, some of them who work for the UNC system, and move it to Raleigh? Why? To get it closer to the seat of government? Which of us thinks that's a good thing? Like, he's having this conversation and he's basically having it with himself, because as Randy Ramsey was only too quick to tell him, this decision has been made. It's been made in Raleigh and they're not interested in our input. Like, we've been handed this decision. Now we need to figure out how we can make it happen.
And I think part of that too is, you have to remember the legislature is presumably representative of the people of the state, and the people of the state don't just have a one issue like the university, right? So it's okay. Well, how does the university work with K through 12? Or with the community college system? And I think that was the impetus for the idea of moving these various boards into one area, because, being in the same building with somebody else, you tend to have more coordination. You're more likely to reach an articulation agreement. You're more likely to say, hey, what are we doing about K through 12 and how can we improve our outcomes? And so I think it's a concerted effort. But there's a lot of little buckets of money out there and fiefdoms where people don't want to give up their own particular control.
Well, and it's always about whose ox is getting gored, right? I mean, I don't know how you feel about profanity on your podcast, but as you can probably tell, I grew up in newsrooms and I'm very in favor of it. So it's interesting because now Republicans are in charge both in Raleigh and in the UNC system. And so their feeling is, let's just move everything to Raleigh because, as you say, there are efficiencies and there are, it should be closer to the seat of government, not farther away or whatever. That is an argument that would have gotten laughed out of every Republican meeting I'd ever been to 15 years ago because they weren't in charge. And the idea was Raleigh, fuck Raleigh, local government, all these decisions should be made as locally as possible or whatever. But Democrats are the same way. Republicans are the same way.
But it's slightly different because you're talking about, let's say, the community college system. So you're covering all the counties in the state.
Yeah.
Or the UNC system. So all 17 schools. And so it's not, you can't really have it. There's no local. It's, where are you going to put it? Well, why? And I think the other reason that people have considered moving is, why is it in Chapel Hill?
Yeah. Well, because that was the first university. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it starts to feel very favored. And the other schools, I did appreciate, and our board was one of the few that started moving around the state, having meetings in other schools.
Right. Just did it at Western.
Yeah. And so I think that's more fair representation. For meetings to move around like that. But in terms of your headquarters and coordination, the idea is if you put them all in one spot, they can all work together.
Right. I just think that's an idea that would have been anathema to Republicans when they were not the majority in Raleigh, because they would have been like, great, yeah, it's there and it's all being run by Democrats. And I mean, there are a lot of examples of that, right? Like I don't remember where you were on this. I tend to think that you were probably on the other side of this issue politically, but this is back when Trudy Wade was like, let's redistrict the city council, but let's do it from Raleigh.
Billboards against it. Yeah. Even though I still support Trudy. I think she's done a lot of great things and I would agree with her on a ton of things out there, but on that one I didn't.
But that's because
actually the 4-year terms, I think makes city council maybe less accountable to the people in the city with a 4-year term versus 2-year term. Now, it does mean you're not constantly running, so there's some benefits out there too. I'm not sure where I come out on that.
But that's another example of that's not a conservative idea. It's not a conservative idea to redistrict a city council from Raleigh. They would have, they would have grabbed pitchforks and flames if Democrats had said, let's go into Carteret County and change, in Havelock, the Havelock City Council. I'd like to change the makeup of the board and how many years it runs and where the lines are and stuff from Raleigh as Democrats, because that's a Republican area, and it's a Republican area in a part of the state that's got nothing to do with Raleigh, and you're just doing it because you can. And that's, But that's what happens with every party. Like, every party that gets enough power wants to exercise that power in the way that they want to exercise it to the benefit of themselves and the people who support them.
Yeah, I don't remember in the past Democrats talking about nonpartisan redistricting or things like that.
And now the Republicans who were talking about it aren't much talking about it. I remember, it's so funny. I was not very far from here in the Greensboro Public Library out in downtown Greensboro. I sat outside with John Hardister when he was a young man who was, just dreaming of holding office one day, and just beginning to wet his toes, in that, area. And his saying to me, what we really need is some nonpartisan redistricting. Like, that really would solve so much if we could just get to the point where we could take some of the R's and D's and the politics out of this. And, it would really make a lot of sense. John Hardister is the majority whip now and you will not hear him say that anymore. Well,
I think because you realize at some point that whoever's in power, if let's say the Republicans agree to nonpartisan redistricting and the Democrats gain back control, it's going to be the first thing they throw out, right? Is the nonpartisan redistricting.
That is the problem with all politics. The problem it's not the problem. One of many problems with politics is that nobody wants justice. Everybody wants revenge. So that, the problem is always, what are they going to do when they get in? What are they going to do when they get in? Right. And it's something that you confront all the time, right? It's like, if you take away the ability of the governor to appoint members of the boards of trustees, for instance, what happens the next time there's a Republican governor and there's a Democratic majority? It's like, well, we're going to throw those dice. You know why? Because we're in power now and we think we're going to be in power for a little while. So
I think we ought to have pop quizzes for the board of trustees and the board of governors.
There we go. Make it merit based. The Hunger Games. Yeah, right. Let's just, really get in there and see what these people are made of. Yeah, it's wacky.
So let me wrap up with one question for you, which is, what's your advice for someone that feels like they can't take that independent line, or they can't be a maverick yet because something's holding them back? What's your advice for how someone can become more of a maverick or an independent thinker in their life?
Well, I think about when I was covering the Guilford County Board of Commissioners. I did that for a few years in Guilford County. And during that time, I got to do it in what I think was a fascinating period, because it went from being Democratic control to Republican control. And then it went back again. Right. And on that board, I really learned a lot about local government and government in general by dealing with a few very strong personalities. Billy Yao, as you might remember, was on the Guilford County Board of Commissioners, who had a Confederate flag tattoo and, once printed up some T-shirts of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes pissing on the NAACP logo, right? Skip Alston, a powerful, controversial, very opinionated black Democrat from Guilford County, was sort of his opposite number, right? And then these new folks came in, some of whom were with that Tea Party movement that sort of swept in, and some of them lasted, some of them didn't. But it's interesting because I worked for the News and Record, because I'm a reporter, because people assume I'm a flaming liberal. They thought, well, you must love dealing with Skip Alston and you must hate dealing with Billy Yao. And it was very much the opposite. I had huge problems dealing with Skip Alston, who was constantly trying to Bigfoot me and bully me and, said on television that I was the most unethical reporter that he'd ever dealt with, and he was never talking to me again. And then like a week later called me up for a story and said, oh no, I was just, and Billy always basically dealt straight with me, even though he sometimes said some very offensive things, and then when the new breed came in, my favorite politician to deal with from a shoot straight tell you what he thinks, always honest perspective, was Jeff Phillips on the board of commissioners, with whom I disagree politically on almost everything. But I thought he was a good guy, religious guy. And I don't mean like being religious makes you, a good person. I mean that I think that he was really doing his best to live in the example of Jesus, which, and also he was conservative. And so we disagreed on some things, but he was great to work with. And so, I think what some of these people have in common though, is that, to them, the most important thing wasn't necessary. Now, some of this has changed. Some of these people have shifted a little bit, but, the most important thing to them wasn't necessarily being on the Republican team, being on the Democratic team. It was deciding what they think is right and then going with that, and sometimes this meant that they would have to buck their own party, or they would have to, I remember Jeff Phillips getting really angry with some of the rhetoric that was coming out of that Conservatives for Guilford County group, which he was part of, which brought him to power. But they were, saying some really destructive, not very honest things, and making some like personal slurs against people. And he just, said to some of the members, like, you really got to knock that out. Like, this is just not appropriate. And you're making us all look bad. And Skip Alston used to have this saying, he probably still says this because he's back on the commissioners now. He used to say, I have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies.
Yeah, he does say that.
Right.
And actually, I've always gotten along with Skip out there. I don't, I really haven't had too much come before the Guilford County Board. It's been rare for me to go before them. But I think that, each person out there has their own personality for sure. And it's interesting to see the conflicts. If you ever want to see a good example, is you go to like the Greater Greensboro Politics page. Mm-hmm. And, there's a slight from like 5 years ago where someone's carrying it on through 5 years later in this thing. That's why I dropped out of that page, because I'm like, God, this is just too much, Fight Club on here instead of exchange of ideas.
Well, the other thing is, social media exacerbates this so much, because even in the early days of when I was working at the News and Record, when like Facebook was basically new, and social media wasn't such a big thing, you'd sometimes talk with people either in the comments on your story, or there would be blogs, remember those, or, early Facebook stuff where people would just get in your face and they'd yell at you and they'd call you names or whatever. And then you'd meet about in the community and they would be just pleasant as punch, because it's different when you're face to face with somebody. And it's, it's wild. It's like, the dealing with Skip, it's like, I don't really have a problem with Skip anymore. When I first came in, I think he did this thing that a lot of politicians do, which is like throw an elbow. Like he wanted to establish his dominance. And so he like screwed with me a little bit. And then like, I think once he saw that like that really wasn't going to work, and if he really wanted to work with me, he could, but he, it got a little better. But, I think that just like deciding for yourself, what are your values, and also understanding that there are going to be people who have different values, and that, that doesn't necessarily make them bad people. It just makes them people with different values. I told you that story about my mother and how, like she shifted politically over the course of her life, on certain issues. And a lot of people in my family are like that. And there are still people, I mean, listen, I got relatives who are absolute gun nuts, who are always packing a pistol, who are, anti-government, anti-everything, folks. And it doesn't mean I don't love them. We just have disagreements. And I think, in terms of being a maverick, I mean, I think that the most maverick thing you can do is make up your mind for yourself and don't be a team player. I mean, like when you become part of a team, where it's like, I'm a Democrat, they're my team. I'm a Republican, I'm their, that's my team. You end up having to apologize for a lot of shit that you yourself wouldn't do and you don't believe in, because of that's your team. And you get dragged along on some stuff just because I got more in common with these people than these people. And I just feel like, Trump is maybe in my lifetime, the ultimate litmus test for this. There are people, I won't name them because it wouldn't be polite, but there are people even locally who I had a lot of respect for, who were Republicans. And when Trump came on the scene, they said, this guy's a maniac. if he ever gets in the White House, God forbid, you know who I like is Ted Cruz. You know who I like is this person. You know who I like is that person. But they were anything but Trump people. When Trump got elected, a bunch of these folks all of a sudden were singing Trump's praises and kissing his ass, and they're doing it to this day. Not because their politics shifted. They still think it privately over a beer. If you catch them, they'll still tell you that guy's fucking crazy.
Well, he cowed a lot of people. I mean, you had people go up against him and he just demolished them.
Oh yeah.
And so, you
like LBJ on steroids.
Yeah. You see that happen enough and people are afraid.
Absolutely.
And especially politicians. I mean, that could destroy your career.
Yeah.
I mean, look around. There's a whole lot of them that have had their careers destroyed because of, consistent bad words from Donald Trump.
Yeah. But imagine being like, I understand that sometimes you feel in politics that you have to compromise for the greater good, or you want to stay in office because you're trying to do the things that you want to do and that you think is good for your state or your constituency. And so you have to put up with some indignities. But imagine being Ted Cruz. Imagine being Ted Cruz, who like really thinks of himself and promotes himself as an intellectual Republican, who's a constitutional conservative, who believes in core conservative principles that William F. Buckley would have agreed with, or, the real conservative stuff. And you have this guy come in, and on his way to the White House, which, by the way, you were trying to get to yourself, he goes, "You're stupid. You're weak. You got an ugly wife. Your let me tell you about your father and your family. And also I espouse all of these things that are actually anti-conservative, like, manipulating the market and tariffs and, and say nothing of all of these other policies that have nothing to do with, that really are kind of to the left of the Democrats in terms of worldview, and stuff. And you got to kiss this guy's ass, which is now the position that Ted Cruz is in. It's, you got to wonder, what's it worth? Like, what's it worth to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And to my mind, it's like one of the things I love about journalism is, what are you going to do to me? What are you going to do to me? You going to vote me out? I mean, even if, when you said earlier, like maybe you'd get canceled or whatever. Well, if I said anything in this interview that's offensive to anybody and my boss has a problem with it or whatever, I don't think that's going to happen, but they could be mad at me and they could even fire me. But you know what I would do is go and get another job.
Well, there are few jobs in the media space right now.
Well,
it is shrinking.
It is. Well, but
you could go to the dark side. You could go into corporate PR or something.
Well,
instead.
I think that the traditional media space is shrinking, but who's growing is everything else. I mean, right now, like I said, the State's Newsroom Network, which is the sort of affiliate thing we're part of, has newsrooms, like brand new newsrooms that are hiring people right now, like more people than we have at Policy Watch. They're hiring each of these newsrooms. They opened one in Nevada recently. They opened one there's one in Maine. There's one in Virginia, the Virginia Mercury. They're staffing up, and they're staffing up with former newspaper reporters, former radio reporters, former TV reporters. They're, all this like legacy heritage media that's going away, that's slowly dying. Things are growing behind that. And, some of it is partisan. Some of it is not. Some of it is partisan depending on your point of view. There are people who don't like ProPublica. There are people who don't like Report for America. There are people who don't like, any of these things, Carolina Public Press, or, but like those things are growing. And I'm not like, I am at the end of the day a capitalist. I would be very disappointed to get paid in hugs and kisses. So I'm not making less money now than I made in newspapers. Trust me. And I don't intend to make less money next year or the year after that. I do this for a living. It's how I put food on the table and sleep indoors. And I intend to be doing that for a very long time. And I think that I want to be doing it in journalism, and I think I'm going to be able to. I think that the media space is evolving in a way that there will always be room for people who can do this and are good at it, and and are consistent with the values of journalism.
And your backup is a novelist now.
I wouldn't want to write a novel. I think that's, if you want to make no money, go into fiction. Yeah. But it's, I think that there are, it's what my dad told me when I wanted to join the Marines, right? He said, there are other ways to serve your country. Right. Yeah. And, it's not that I look down on anybody who's serving their country in the Marine Corps, quite the opposite. But I think that what I do is good for society. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think that. And so, Like if I can do that and pay my bills, problem solved.
Absolutely. So one last question.
Sure.
If, for people out there, I think there are a lot of people out there that deal with the media, and some of them are scared of the media. They see the media as fake news, or they see the media as evil. And so they get a call from a reporter, or they have a story they want to tell about a new business launch. What's your advice for people in dealing with the media?
Well, I mean, it's my advice that you'd give to anybody else, which is that you really have to treat people with the respect and the grace that you would want for yourself. So, like I used to call people up from the News and Record, and they'd be like, "Oh, the News and Record. One time this reporter from the News and Record wrote this thing that I didn't like or whatever." And I would say, that happens. There are bad reporters everywhere. I have no doubt that we're on the receiving end of some of that. How about you just talk to me? And if I screw you, you don't have to talk to me next time. And I think that most people who have dealt with me would tell you, I'm not looking to screw you. I'm not looking to misquote you. I'm not looking to make you look bad. And I think that if you deal with reporters on that basis, and if they do misquote you, if they get facts wrong and they won't correct them, or they won't, make a clarification or something like that, then you'll know that that's a bad reporter and you don't need to deal with that person anymore. But
so judge the reporter, not the outlet.
Absolutely.
Or the prior experience with other reporters, and look at each reporter for their personal journalistic integrity.
I think so. I mean, the thing I always remember is somebody said to me, a friend of mine who's a doctor, I was telling him about going to a doctor and having a bad experience. I thought that this doctor was dismissive of me. And then I went to another doctor and they were able to figure out the problem right away. And they weren't dismissive. And he said, "Yeah, you know why?" And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because everybody was the worst. Somebody was the worst doctor in every class." People think that because you're a doctor, that's magical powers or something. It's the same way with the media. Somebody's the worst reporter at their paper. Somebody's the worst reporter in the whole state. You might get that guy, or you could get a really good one. You just don't know yet. And what you got to remember is, people are people. And also you never know who's who. I mean, at one point, Mark Banker, rest his soul, was working at the News and Record and was a local reporter. And in a couple of years after that, he was the State House reporter. And then a couple of years after that, he was a big deal at WRAL, right? And people who dealt with Mark when he was a local reporter would tell you the same thing that people told, what Phil Berger said about him at his funeral, which is Mark was a great reporter. He's what every reporter should be. I couldn't tell you right now what Mark's politics are, because that wasn't part of his job. And I think that that's great. He was that same guy when he was covering the Guilford County Board of Commissioners and taking guff from Skip Alston, so, good reporters are good reporters always, in all circumstances. Not that they don't sometimes make mistakes. Bad reporters are bad reporters, and they're out there, and we don't like them any more than you do.
And if people want to read some of your articles or follow you on social media out there, what are the different ways for them to do
so
that?
I'm on Twitter at Joe Killian PW for Policy Watch. And I'm pretty active there, and people can message me or DM me. My DMs are open. And if you want to read any of my stuff, it's all out there for free at ncpolicywatch.com, or Google me and read some of my old stuff and laugh at it. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate your generous time today, and always enjoy chatting with you, and appreciate you getting people's quotes right, and
I try.
And trying to be fair, even if you work for the evil liberal papers out there. So again, appreciate your time, and thanks.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
So I look forward to having more conversations with Joe and with people like Joe, which is to say people that differ on many viewpoints from me, but someone that we can have a respectful conversation and talk about our differences and actually be open to hearing what the other person has to say. I walked away from this conversation thinking about a few things. thinking about the role of the media and journalism, the fourth estate. I thought Joe had a great point about what's the real impact of cancel culture. I talk about it, and I talk about cancel culture a bunch. And I think it's annoying, but to his point, what's the real impact of it? If you tick off one group, maybe you're pleasing another. So is there really an impact to cancel culture? Can you really be canceled? I'm going to have to give that one some more thought, but I thought he had some valid points there. In some ways, him talking about the lack of impact of cancel culture emboldens me and makes me feel a lot better that no, there aren't really repercussions. And I say that jokingly. There are repercussions to anything you say or do. But I think we've almost made it a little bit too boogeyman-ish that there's a scary, evil cancel culture out there that really lacks some of the teeth that we would attribute to it. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and you're now getting a flavor for what I'm trying to do with this podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please follow and make sure to give us feedback. You can do that on any of the review sites out there for podcast, or you can shoot me an email or at marty@mavericksmarty, or you can call us, and that's 41-podcasts. So 4 podcasts. And send me a message. Let me know what you're thinking. Thanks for tuning in.